So welcome back. We have a couple of announcements before we get started today. But today is going to be a packed day, and you'll be happy to hear that the logo wear person is coming at the end of class. So we want to be able to plow on through and get there. Well, we'll talk about that when she gets here. That's her deal. I think she's going to be able to do credit cards, but she'll let you know. Okay, so today, as we speak, several master gardeners are on Channel 3 doing a broadcast on spring planting on Coast Live. Do not watch it right now because that would take away from our presentation, but please do check it out later. Barb will be posting it to our Facebook page, or you can see it obviously by searching Coast Live. Evals, thanks to everybody who returned those. It sounds like you guys enjoyed Kate's humor and the Dune Garden and all those good things. So we're glad that class went well for you. And I will put in a personal plug for working at the Dune Garden if you're so inclined. That's one of my regular places and it's a lot of fun. In a minute, we will do the chapter review recap. But in the meantime, please make sure you picked up handouts on your way in. Barb has some things back on the table. Today we'll have our last two commercials. In a moment after our chapter review, Sally Hartman, our VP, will be doing a commercial for the Elizabeth River Trail, and then we will be into today's session.
Okay, the chapter review seemed to go really well, and really I was hard pressed to decide that we really needed to talk about any of the specific questions, because there would be one person missed one here and another, one person missed one there, so we didn't have any big trip ups. It didn't look like, but I will say just something about a couple of them. The first question, which of the terms refers to the variety of gene species and ecosystems across a landscape? We had a couple of people who chose habitat instead of biodiversity. And I wanted to tell you the reason, the thing that makes the habitat and the biodiversity different here is genes. A habitat is not going to take into account the genetics so much. Okay, so that's where that comes from. Question number 3 was which wildlife group accounts for over 30% of the species of concern for population decline in Virginia? I think that in the text that was fairly clearly delineated as insects. However, Deborah did such a good job about talking about the decline of birds that several of you carried that great information, very important information, over to the exam. So birds just a little bit less than insects. Okay. All right. And then the other one that I was going to say something about is number 5. Which of the following terms best describes the process of change in a plant community over time? So your best choice there was succession. And if you think about maybe a clear-cut forest, and think about, what comes up first is weeds, and then what comes up second is, the cheap, easy plant trees or shrubs, and then the trees. So that is a succession of planting. You can sometimes see the same thing in your own yard. If you clear out a space, those weeds are going to be there really quickly, but over time, they may be displaced. Even without your assistance, they may be displaced by other plants that are bigger and hardier than the weeds. So any other questions, though, that you needed any? Okay, good, thanks.
Okay, Sally, come on down.
So I'm Sally Hartman, and I'm the co-lead on the Elizabeth River Trail collaboration. And this grew out of Jim Affelt's class project. And Jim and I had the joy of being in the 2020 class, which came to a screeching halt in March, and that everything got figured out and went to Zoom. And one highlight was his class project. and he chose to do a botanical guide to the Elizabeth River Trail, which he lives near and loves and uses. Since 2020, we did a lot of informal botanical walks and bike rides on it. And then last year, latter part of the year, it became an official Norfolk Master Gardener project, one where you can get hours, and you are very much needed because we're new. So I'm going to just give you a very brief little overview here. How are we doing? Oh, awesome. So the trail is 10.5 miles long. It runs from Norfolk State University up to Norfolk International Terminals, and I'm betting most of you have been on at least some segment of it. It is run by the nonprofit Elizabeth River Trail Foundation, and they are our partner in our collaborative project. It's a wonderful uniter of our city. It's a connector because that trail runs either through or near 28 different neighborhoods, passes colleges, universities, libraries, historical sites. It's just an amazing link through our city. So it also needs a lot of work because if you think of a 10.5 mile trail, well, it has two sides and there's lots of invasive things growing along there. 500,000 people used the trail last year. I have been out the past 2 weekends working on it with different groups. And I would say each time in the 2 hours or so we're there, at least 100 people come by. They're walking, they're biking, they're running, they're strolling kids, they're walking dogs. So it is a well-used and loved part of our city. It also runs by some pretty amazing gardens. The Pagoda Garden down in Freemason. We've got Wyanoke Preserve there, Hermitage. So pretty awesome places. So we do two things on the trail, and we could use your help. One are beautification and maintenance events where we educate and guide volunteers. The Elizabeth River Trail Foundation has a green team of volunteers who come out, and they are very enthusiastic. They also often have no idea if this plant should stay or go or this. And so we help them a lot to learn in our educational component there. We also do botanical walks and bike rides through various parts of the trail that need help. Here's some of the partners we've had over time. We've worked with ODU students, the Scouts, garden clubs, businesses. The volunteers just come from all kinds of places. The other week I was out there, we had the new head of the ODU English department. There were some ODU students. There were some Navy personnel, a retired attorney. It's a whole variety of people. And then the last special project, when Deborah and I were out there, the last weekend was a Boy Scout troop where one of the scouts was working on his Eagle Scout project. So you get a whole variety of work and volunteers out there. So since 2020, we have hosted 27 botanical tours. And while everybody thinks of us as the biking people, actually 12 of those were walking tours, 9 were biking, and 6 of the tours, we visited homeowners' gardens in neighborhoods that are along the trail. And that was really interesting learning from them too. And I want to thank Randy and Renee, who came out for our last March in our beautification project that we do on the 4th. So what we have going forward, which is actually started in March when Randy and Renee came out, is the 4th Friday of each month. We host a morning of a beautification maintenance on some segment of the trail. We were in March, we were there kind of behind Benchtop Brewing in Chelsea. And that we will be doing that up through October until the weather changes on the 4th Fridays, and we'd love to have you helping. We also will be doing on the 4th Saturday bike ride or a walk again through the fall. And we could use your help, either helping organize it or coming along on it, and working with the people. And those are all free for people who may sign up in advance. So we're going to be on April 26th at the Monarch Way Station, which is behind the Fort Norfolk Medical Building, and information will go out about that. And the 27th is actually National Trails Day, and we're going to go on a bike ride from Plum Point Park downtown, looking at spring plants that are blooming. So we definitely could use volunteers. And you will get e-blasts from Susan looking for volunteers. So please sign up when you can, or contact me or Jim. And he would love to be here, but he is in North Carolina. His mother was recently widowed, so he is working with her today. But we hope you will come. And our May tour is going to be in Colonial Place on May 25th. So if anybody lives in Colonial Place and has ideas of gardens to visit and people who would welcome us, please let us know. Thank you very much.
So these events are on the calendar. You can sign up to put it on your own calendar, but you still need to contact Sally and Jim if you want to participate.
Thanks, Sally. And we'll have another commercial. I think at halftime, we're scheduled to have a commercial on Arbor Day, another one of our big events. So stay tuned for that. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Theresa Augustin, who is on the staff here at the Norfolk Botanical Gardens, and our fabulous speaker today. This was one of my very favorite sessions a couple of years ago. Theresa is a graduate of Old Dominion University with a BS in biology. She joined the staff of the garden in 2000 as an apprentice gardener and was promoted to curator of natural areas in 2004. In 2016, as part of the garden's initiative to become a leader in environmental education and stewardship, she became the garden's first director of environmental engagement and outreach. In 2021, Theresa was promoted to her current role as vice president of education. Her position focuses on educational initiatives, community outreach, and developing strategies to increase environmentally sustainable practices both internally and within the community. Since 2011, she also has served as a committee member of ODU's Lytton J. Musselman Endowed Natural History Lecture Series. She's also a past vice president of the Virginia Native Plant Society's Southampton Roads chapter. She brings to the garden a passion and enthusiasm for the natural world, with a particular interest in native plant communities, conservation, and macro fungi, which for some of us means shrooms. Yay! I want to take a walk with her one day in the woods. So please join me in welcoming Theresa to our class.
Well, I'm very happy to be here today. It's great to see so many smiling faces on a beautiful sunny spring day. I do want to give the Master Gardeners a shout out before I get started. You guys are a huge support for what we do here, from helping us in our kitchen garden to helping us with programs. Sometimes we collaborate on community events that go on. We donate plants. It's just a fabulous relationship, and I'm so happy it's continuing on. And this is one of the largest classes ever, I understand, so that is fantastic. Before I get rolling into this, I just want to say, native plants, mushrooms, my passion. I want to chat with you guys about it. I don't want to talk at you the whole time. So if there's something that gets mentioned and you're like, hey, I want to know more about that, just raise your hand and ask the question. Let's have a conversation as we go along. I know how boring it can be if someone is just talk all day long. So with that, we'll get rolling here. So the way we'll do the program is I'll cover native plants and woody plants first. I believe we take a break, and then we'll jump into mushrooms. So we'll save the best for last, get you guys super pumped before you head out. Okay, so we're just going to review a few, just some glossary terms, some definitions. So when we define a woody plant, we're talking about plants that have hard stems. They do not die back in winter. They're comprised of secondary growth, and this is secondary xylem. That's what makes wood wood. The cells in the secondary xylem are thickened by deposits of lignin, and lignin is it's a really tough material. And the reason I put a little mushroom icon right there is because that's the role of fungus in the forest, right? They are breaking down that lignin because nothing else will break it down but a fungus. So that's why we'll give a little shout out before we jump into the mushrooms, but something to think about. So definition for trees is, small tree is 15 to 25 feet, medium 25 to 50, and large is over 50 feet. Shrubs, small shrubs 3 to 5 feet, medium 5 to 9, large 9 feet and over. These are guidelines, and I can tell you from working with plants my whole career, sometimes that's a moving target, right? You may have a multi-stemmed small tree that might look like a shrub from afar, so they're guidelines, they're not absolutes, but it's just something for you guys to keep in mind. And of course, ground covers are 3 feet and below. Vines, twine, they have little rootlets, they have tendrils. Woody plants can be deciduous or evergreen, and deciduous means they lose their leaves in the fall. They could be evergreen where evergreen means they can be broadleaf, just, like a magnolia tree, or it can be a conifer like a pine tree. And they're pretty long lived. Woody plants live for centuries, if not for 1,000+ years, so they have a really long lifespan, or they can have a really long lifespan. Not all live a long time. Like, for example, our native cherry tree lives about 50 years. And when I tell that to folks, like, wow, that's long lived. I'm like, well, not really. And for our lifespan, yes. But in the grand scheme of things, we have trees that live 300, 500 years old, so that's a really long time. And those trees tell very interesting stories when you look at the tree rings and you look at the core samples. They can tell you all sorts of climate data, things that happened in history. It's very fascinating. So to contrast our woody plants, of course, herbaceous, these are soft stems. They're green, they're flexible, they die back in winter. These are your annuals, your biennials, your perennials, and of course they can be deciduous or evergreen as well. I know this is very basic stuff. We'll get the basic stuff over with, and then we'll dive into other concepts. So we want to talk about the ornamental and environmental value of woody plants. They're very important to us. We pick them for their blooms, their fall color, their fragrance, the fruit they produce. They can be the focal point of a design. Maybe you're using them as a visual screen. You don't want to see your neighbor. You don't want to see the road. So they have a lot of value for us as well as wildlife. They're environmental workhorses. They create cooling shade. All this information out there about how you can create curb appeal and reduce, some of the energy costs of your home. And that's from the shade created from these beautiful trees. They can help mitigate stormwater runoff. That's we're in a huge watershed. I consider all of Norfolk a gigantic watershed. So everything you do on your yard or in your garden can affect what happens down that line, right? So woody plants are fabulous for that, especially native plants. Their root systems are just more robust. They're deeper. They're just more effective. They can remove air pollutants, sequester carbon. We talk a lot about climate change and the impact of carbon, and these are plants that they take that in from the atmosphere and store it in all their biomass. So when you lose a big tree or we have a big storm, it's like, oh, there goes all that carbon's gone now, going back into the atmosphere. And they support many species of wildlife. A lot of our woody plant species are considered keystone species, and a keystone species means that the entire survival of an ecosystem depends on that particular species, right? So an oak tree is a great example of that. If you remove an oak tree, you have removed so many ecological services that tree is providing. So the rest of the ecosystem start to decline, or it just becomes weakened. They've lost a huge resource that supports so many other species. Planting and selecting plants, you guys know this. This is a mantra you've probably heard forever, right? Right plant in the right place. I mean, it's very basic, but very true. And even, experienced gardeners have these little issues. They're like, oh, I was trying to see if it would work. Like, what was the tolerance range of this plant? Let me just try. You just want to try. So if you don't match it up, the conditions that the plant thrives in, you can have some issues there. When we talk about native plants, there's a lot of information, like you'll see the big bold headlines for it is like easy to care for, less maintenance, less water. But that only holds true if you plant it where it wants to be planted, right? So if you're putting a wetland species in a very dry area, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to establish that plant because it's just not, it doesn't have the moisture it needs in the soil. It'll eventually get established, but it will probably be stressed an awful lot because it just doesn't have the conditions consistently that it needs to thrive. So, but that seems pretty intuitive, but sometimes we just have to remind ourselves, I'm guilty of it. I'm like, let me just see what I can do here. And you want to pick healthy specimens. And I put this image of that incredibly root-bound tree, or it might be a shrub there, just to give you guys a visual. There are so many plants in nurseries and garden centers that are like that. They've just been sitting in the pots forever. Those roots are circling and circling and circling. Sometimes that gets so tight that it actually repels water. The plant cannot absorb water. So it's really hard to get a deep water, to get it watered deeply into those roots. So you want to check the specimens before you plant them, or you're recommending to other folks, when you guys go out into the community and you're talking to other garden enthusiasts, you want to pick the best specimen possible. So what if you get stuck with that? What do you do with that plant? Like, it's the only one they have. It's what we got. We can't change anything about it. You need to be aggressively ripping those roots apart, and don't be shy about it. Just get in there and rip it apart. In some cases, we have taken hand saws and just shaved everything off, and it's okay. I know that feels like, oh gosh, I probably shouldn't take this as, a support system of the plant. I probably shouldn't remove all of that. But actually, you're doing the plant a favor. And what that does is it triggers the plant to grow more roots. The roots are going to go outward, and that's what we want. You want them to go out as far as they can around the plant. That gives them stability. That gives them the best chance to establish well. So don't be shy in cutting that stuff up or taking a shovel to it or your pruners, anything. Wanted to share this diagram with you guys about proper planting, especially when it comes to trees. So we're talking about getting them established well. We talked about, the roots. So how do you get them in the ground in the best way possible so they have an excellent chance of surviving and perhaps living hundreds of years and being a legacy tree that you plant somewhere? So you want to make sure the root ball, when you're planting that, you give it 2 to 3 feet. Give it, or 2 to 3 times the size of the root ball, excuse me. You want to give it plenty of space for you to go in there, pack the soil in around. If you have to maybe manipulate some roots so they go straight out, you have the space to do that. And you also need that space to eliminate air pockets. If roots come into contact with air, they die. Right? So if you aren't really like packing that in, and you're just kind of like, I'll just throw it in, it'll be fine. There's pockets of air in there that could inhibit root growth. And, we're trying our best to encourage as much root growth as possible. Some of what we do here is we pack some dirt in, we get it stable, we might water it, put more dirt in, water it. So it's kind of like this layered approach. And so everything settles very well and you get a true sense of where that soil is at. Now, we're not packing it in to compact the soil. We're just making sure that those air pockets are eliminated. You can stake the plant if you feel that's necessary. It's not always necessary. The more a plant moves, the stronger it gets. So we want some of that movement in a tree to strengthen it. And I'm sure you've seen examples around town in landscapes where that staking has been left on a little too long, and you can see where it's starting to girdle the trunk. It can influence the tree to grow in the wrong direction because it got off kilter somehow, like it shifted. So that's really important to keep your eye on that. And you don't want anything that's going to be tight around the trunk as well. You want some loose material. Sometimes there's it's I think like a nylon material. It almost looks like a flat rope, but it's very friendly to the bark of the tree. So it just kind of rests against that and just holds it in place. So it's not like you're gripping it very tightly. You want the tree to be able to grow and breathe, so if you will. Good time to do some pruning too. When you put a small tree in, you can reach everything, right? So you want to go in there and clean up all those branches, anything that's dead, that's rubbing, that looks diseased. You have a chance to open it up, get all that good airflow, prevent any kind of openings, if you will, for problems down the line. And make sure you take off the tagging. I have seen that a couple times, not often, but I've seen it a couple times where the flagging tape's flipping around at the top and it's like, oh, I wish they would have taken that off. Okay, let's go in and talk now more about the plants. Let's get excited about the plants. I love native plants. We all love native plants, right? Hopefully. If not, I'll convince you today. So for the overview, we're going to define native, believe it or not. Sometimes people are on different pages with what exactly native means. You can be on one extreme or the other. So we'll just talk about that. We'll talk about their value. Why do we want to plant them? It's more than just, they serve many purposes. So we'll talk about it. And of course, I want to highlight the beauty. One of the reasons why we garden, why we love plants is because they're beautiful and they're attractive to us. So I can show you some beautiful native plants that are just as attractive and stunning as some of the non-native ornamentals that are out there in the trade. So let me just show you, go over these pictures very quickly. So the blueberry flower in the upper right-hand corner, that's one of our native blueberries. And that's a specialist bee. That's a specialist native bee in there. It's called the eastern blueberry bee. And a specialist bee means it only has one plant that it goes to get pollen. And pollen is food for their babies, right? So the reason they're in there is to gather that food for the next generation. Now, the nectar attracts them in, and it's kind of the reward for doing it. But they're there to gather that pollen. But that's the one plant that bee is going to go to. So when you see blueberry bushes full of blueberries, you can thank that little bee because he is the most effective pollinator for that plant. Not to go too deep into the pollinators, but our native pollinators do something called buzz pollination. So they can vibrate at a certain frequency, which helps release the pollen. Honeybees are great pollinators, we know this, but they're not as in tune as our native pollinators are with our plants. So that's a cool little fact I learned. It makes a lot of sense, right? Everybody evolves with everybody else, and you know the best way to interact, and that's that buzz pollination. Right below that is a little bee squeezing its fat body into a native plant called turtlehead. It's either turtlehead or it's the Physostegia, the obedient plant, but they have those little small flowers like that. It's just squeezing its little body, and you can see those pollen sacs on its legs, so you know it's female more or less. The middle picture down low. Now, if y'all have ever seen this, now our red buds are jamming right now. They're blooming. Pretty soon the leaves are going to be out. So pay attention to them and see if you see those little cutouts. That's not bad damage. That's actually the leaf cutter bee taking out just those little half moon shapes to basically wallpaper their nests in the ground, right? So that's a good sign. It took me a while, it took a lot of us here at the garden to realize what that was, and it was a beneficial thing, to celebrate. It's like, hey, that, even though it's a chewed leaf and, we're concerned about aesthetics, that's evidence of something fabulous going on. So we now celebrate that for sure. And then, of course, we have the hummingbird on our native honeysuckle. That's just those colors. It's just such a stunning combination to have them. And I think we're very familiar with the Japanese honeysuckle. It's like, why would you choose that if you had to choose it over this beautiful, like, bright coral flower? Okay. On to natives. So for our purposes, and when I managed the native plant garden, it was all about knowing where that plant evolved. They evolved for thousands of years in a certain place. And so that, or a particular region, right? So that's how we define it. Folks can get into historical and geographical if you want to dial it in a little bit more. Historical meaning it was here before Jamestown was settled. There's a lot of plants that came over with the colonists, and they have become incorporated in our native landscape, not in a bad way. I consider them the minglers. They're not the manglers. They're not invasive. They're not out competing our native plants, but technically they did not evolve here. So that's where I like to draw the line, and let's put them on the side they belong in, right? Some folks can get a little heated about it. I don't. It's more about looking at the scientific, like, regional distribution. Now, of course, these plants over hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands and on years of geologic time that these plants have become adapted to the region that they're in, and that's, to the climate, to the soils, the time of rainfall, the amount of rainfall. Are they adapted to drought? You think about plants that are native to the desert region. They are adapted to lean soils and drought conditions, which you do not find here. We are very wet here. We want to be a forest, so you're going to find plants that are deciduous. They drop their leaves when it gets cold to, prevent damage, and they come out in the spring because that's what the climate tells us or tells them to do. And also the interaction with other species. So we talked about the bees. There's specialist bees where there's one good pollinator for one plant. There's generalists, of course, but we want to always plant for the specialists because they're the ones that have the limited resources. Sometimes when you are reading about native plants, you might come across a statement about provenance. And provenance is just dialing it in exactly where that plant is from. So you want to plant, you want to know this. If you're doing a restoration site, you want a plant that is like that plant was sourced as close to your site you're working in as possible, right? So if we're working in Virginia Beach, I want a plant that's at least from Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Norfolk, Suffolk, something like that, right? I don't want a plant that's native to our region, but it's from New York, or, that's a whole different set of climate conditions and situations that it's adapted to and wouldn't really be the best fit for us here. Really, in my opinion, it matters most when you're doing restoration sites. For the landscape trade, you really can't control that too much because of all the cultivars and who's breeding where, and this is from the south, that's from the north. It's your garden. Ideally, though, you want to have plants so that are closer to where your garden is located than not. Geographical, when we, gardening here for the native plant garden, it was all about what's the coastal plain. That's where we're located, right? So it was very important that the plants there represent the coastal plain of Virginia. And in case this is some new conversation points for you, the coastal plain runs to about I-95, and then from there, it's the Piedmont, then you go into the mountain range, and it's all about the geology. It's what the soils dictate, from our sandy, acidic soil to more rocky, basic soil as you move across the state. I have to talk about invasives every time I talk about natives, right? I've got to do it because not everything you see in a wild area is going to be native. So you might walk into a forest and like, wow, look at that beautiful little pink flower. I want that. That looks great. And you assume it's native because you're in a natural area. That would be, and that's, you're not wrong in wanting to assume that. But sometimes there are things that don't belong there and we don't want to accidentally keep moving them about because they look so cool and, you just, oh, I got to have that. I love it. I might see things up in the mountains that are new to me. And I always Google and look them up. And I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that was an Asian plant. Dang, because it was really pretty, like a beautiful aster that's up there. And I'm like, oh, shoot. Okay, but that's okay. There's plenty of native asters to fill that in. So to define invasive plants, these are plants that are either intentionally or accidentally introduced by human activity into a region in which they did not evolve, and they can cause harm to natural resources, economic activity, humans, livestock, all of that. So if it didn't evolve here, it's not native here. Now you can have North American natives that are invasive in North America, and that's when you dial it down and say, this East Coast native is not a friend on the West Coast. It's actually problematic. Many of our invasive species, if you look on the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation has a list. If you look at those plants, you'll see most of them are from Asia, and that's because our climate is very similar. And if you think about the history of gardening, when you had an exotic plant and you brought in, that's what gardens were about. At one point, it was about showing off what you had in these beautiful ornamental plants, and these are from exotic lands. Come see what I have because no one else has it. So now they have a foothold and we see them everywhere. I think 64, if you go from here to the mountains, you'll see a who's who of invasive plants, and kind of do your own education as you go. They are, for our state, just to give you a little background, there is a list, and they are ranked from high, moderate, and low based on what kind of problems they are to the state. Is it hard to maintain? What's their spread? What's their impact, especially economically? And there are some ornamental plants on the list, but for the most part, they're just weedy things. So if you reference that list and you're like, hey, I wanted to plant this barberry because it's a beautiful, there's this cultivar that has a beautiful purple leaf, and you see barberry on the list, which you will, you might say, maybe I'll skip that, I'll find something else, you know, and maybe there's a couple dozen ornamental plants. So think of all the plants that are out there. So a couple dozen you won't miss, right? And always cross-reference. There has been forward progress within the state. There's some bills being put forth this go round addressing invasive plants. One just got denied. It was to ban the sale of English ivy in the state. We all, yeah, we're like, oh yeah, English ivy. There's a couple of other ones up for, I don't know when they're coming up, but coming up soon possibly, addressing labeling plants as invasive so that you as the consumer can go in and say, oh, okay, that's an invasive and it's telling me to pick something else. Because right now there's nothing, encouraging, nurserymen or landscape folks to tell you that this plant is a problem. You know, they sell to everywhere, and just because it's invasive here might not be to their customer further south or something. There's a couple of, I was trying to think, the couple other bills I think relate to how to treat them and some of the funding that can go to it. And there was one other one that I think it has more to do with like Central Virginia and some of the livestock issues that they have there. But it's very interesting that invasives are moving up that list of priority. Okay, so when we're planting natives, maybe you've heard some folks say, oh, don't plant the cultivars. They're not as good as the straight species. Again, it depends. That's a complex question and a complex answer. So you guys know, I'm sure you've covered this already, what a cultivar is, right? And so basically, it's a genetically homogeneous plant that is selected for an aesthetic quality, right? So there's a uniformity to it. So you basically have a clone that you're putting out there over and over and over again. And a hybrid is a crossbreeding. Sometimes that happens naturally. Sometimes that's folks in a lab taking, 5 different plants here and 5 different plants here, the pollen of it, mixing it up and seeing what they can get to achieve a certain quality again. So it just depends, and it's kind of up to you. You want to look at the plant and see, is it functioning? Does it still have flower parts that a pollinator can get to? Is it producing seed? Is it producing fruit? Does it have nectar? Is there a change in the chemical makeup of the leaf? Because a lot of plants are put out there to be chewed by caterpillars, which are then the food source for all the birds that we love out here. So you have to tolerate chewing to a certain degree, especially if you love butterflies, right? Their host plants. Their caterpillars are on these native plants. They're the host plants. You got to tolerate the chewing for that. So if there's some kind of change to the chemical makeup of the plant, that could inhibit a food source for a lot of insects and other creatures. And sometimes with the breeding, you get out of sync bloom. So it's blooming earlier, but the pollinator is not emerging. So now the pollinator doesn't have a food source. It's just everything's starting to get out of kilter. I've seen it where, you're striving for some particular color combination or a petal shape or color, and at the expense of the vigor of the plant, that you get a weaker plant because all that energy is going into creating some big, beautiful flower, and it's just not a long-lived plant. We mentioned the sterility issue. So I use this echinacea as an example because I'm pretty sure you guys know what the standard echinacea looks like, just purple petals, right? And it has that ray of flowers, kind of like a sunflower in the center. So if you look at this plant, this is totally different, right? A lot of modifications going on here. It's beautiful, it's stunning. I'd stop to look at it and want to take a picture because it draws you in. But if you dig a little deeper and look a little closer, where are the flowers? Where would the pollinators go? Those have all been modified now into petals. So there are no flowers, there are no nectar sources, no pollen sources. So the goldfinches won't come in and eat the seeds in the fall. So you just want to be aware of that. And how do you know? When I'm at garden centers or nurseries and I'm looking at plants, I look for activity. If I see, because you're in an open air, environment, I just look, is a bee landing on that and hanging out for a little while? Because not all cultivars are bad and not all hybrids are bad, right? So like I said, complex question, complex answer. Is that everyone cool? Make sense to y'all? Cool. Okay, keep rolling. All right. So why native plants? I think if I were to ask that without showing anything, it's like, oh, it's good for the environment, it supports wildlife, right? But in some cases, it's detrimental. You must have them. We must preserve these areas. I use this example of longleaf pine. That's not a red cockaded woodpecker up there, but the longleaf pine and the red cockaded woodpecker have a, like they're almost, you can't almost, the red cockaded woodpecker declined as the longleaf pine declined in the state, and that's because it builds its nest in these mature longleaf pines. So there's only a couple dozen birds, in the state. They're trying to bring these numbers back, but that's a direct correlation right there. So we want to balance that out. We want to protect biodiversity, and biodiversity equals variety equals genetic variety, which gives resiliency. The more redundancy you have in a system, like, hey, all these plants are supporting butterflies, or these group of plants are supporting the birds. So when you have redundancy, you can lose a few things, but still keep all those animals and the ecosystem services supported. So the more we reduce that, the less resiliency we have, which we don't want, because there goes your biodiversity and that domino effect. That's the doom and gloom, but we won't dwell on that because we know that we want to do better for it. You want to stabilize and expand food webs with it. Less water, less chemicals, right plant, right place for that. They're beautiful. There's been so many strides made over the past 10, 15 years of recognizing native plants and the beauty that they have, right? That they can serve the same purposes and goals that some of these ornamental, superstar plants in the trade can do. And I love to tell stories. I'd love to create a sense of place, some regional pride. What do we have here on the coastal plain of Virginia that's going to, excite somebody or make them feel that I got a sense of what that area was like, right? You want to take them to Seashore or First Landing State Park. You want to show them some bald cypress trees. You want to go out to Ocean View and show them these big, beautiful live oaks that are out there that are windswept. You want to get that sense of what a place is. You don't want everything to look like the mall. And you see that landscape over and over and over again across the country. It's so boring. And to tell stories, let's talk about longleaf pine. Why is it called the tree that built Tidewater? What's that significance to our port system here? What are naval stores? Get talking about that. It gets you excited about where you're from. A little bit more about the pollinators. So approximately 80 to 90% of all plants are pollinated by animals, and that's mostly invertebrates, native bees, butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, all of them. I do want to point out butterflies really quickly. Sometimes they're labeled as like incidental pollinators because they're really there to get the nectar and they're not really moving the pollen around to go feed their babies like a bee is doing. But our native azaleas depend on swallowtail butterflies to reproduce. So if you've ever seen a native azalea, they have these honeysuckle shaped flowers and they have their flower parts way out in front of those petals, right? So the swallowtail lands on the outside of those petals and it's flapping its wings as it's nectaring. Well, as it's doing that, it's touching the pollen sacs on there and it's bringing out that pollen and it's moving it all around and it's actually pollinating doing that, right? That was something recently discovered by scientists studying our native azaleas in like North Carolina. I think they witnessed these swallowtails and found out what was going on and did some slow motion photography and saw like this ribbon of pollen comes out and then it just flaps it all about and it's like shaking out a rug and all the pollen's going everywhere. Oh, it was really fascinating. And one of those intricate relationships, you're like, man, nature is cool. Vertebrates can also be pollinators. There's several plants that are exclusively pollinated by hummingbirds. Their parts are just in the right place for the bird to hit it on its head and then move it from plant to plant. I thought this was a really good metric, if you will, to remember is that native woody plants used as ornamentals support 14 times as many species as introduced ornamentals. So when you can quantify it like that and then, share that and talk about it, that means something. You get it. It's a very tangible concept to sink in. So just the pictures here, that's a leafcutter bee. On top there on a Stokes aster. And leafcutter bees are very distinct because they carry their pollen on their abdomen. Remember you're used to seeing bees that have like the little pollen sacs on their legs as they're flying around. So they have it on their abdomen, which you can see in that top picture. And then below, I believe that's a type of sweat bee, pollen all over its legs, and that's on a echinacea. When you're planting for pollinators, you need continuous sequential support or source of pollen and nectar all season long. They're out now, come March, that's when your pollinators are starting to emerge for the season, and they go sometimes into like September, November. That's a long run. So what are they nectaring from right now? And it's a lot of your woody plants, your maple trees, they're out and blooming. That's a great source from. There's other smaller native plants, shrubs that they're hitting up for that. You need masses of color, at least 3 species. They just need to find it, onesie twosies here and there. That's like a needle in a haystack. But if you have masses of stuff, then they can target in and see it and be like, oh, that's where I need to go. There's my buffet. And do a diversity, for us and for them, attract all the different pollinators, all the different shapes, sizes, and colors of flowers are going to be appreciated and used. And it's okay, in my opinion, to mix straight species and cultivars and hybrids, as long as you see that function is there. I don't want to, be too restrictive. You just want to make educated choices, that is going to support the ecosystem there. Tolerate some leaf chewing. We've already covered that, right? And reduce your chemical use. Sometimes it's a threshold. Like, it's been ingrained in us that we can't see things, no chewed leaves. Like, that's a bad thing. We don't want to see that in our ornamental landscape. It's okay if there's a few little weeds there. It doesn't have to be, perfectly clean. You find that balance, and you can reduce where you can, or you use alternate techniques for it. Maybe you're using like the newspaper thing to smother your weeds, or you're just mulching. You use mulch in a timely manner so that seeds are getting suppressed instead of being allowed to germinate. And then just sit back and observe, see who comes, see what the diversity is, the who's of pollinators. You'll be surprised just how cool they look, and how creative nature is at some of the trickery, if you will, making a harmless bee or a harmless fly look like a bee, so that the predator's like, oh, I don't want to mess with that guy, he's going to sting me. But it's really just a fly. He's just mimicking somebody who looks a bit tougher. All right, let's talk native. Let's get to the plants. All right, Eastern red cedar, fabulous evergreen, makes an excellent screen. Now these plants are dioecious, and dioecious means there's a plant that has female flowers and a plant that will have, these are 2 individual plants. One has female flowers, one has male flowers. So you have to have both in order to get your fruit. And it's always easy at the end of the season to determine who is the male plant, who is the female plant, because the female's covered in berries. It brings in cedar waxwings. Look at these beautiful birds. These come in droves here and just pick everything clean. But there's such beautiful birds. And I feel like it's not like seeing a unicorn, but it's just a special moment when you're like, man, these birds came in, they were so cool. And to me, that's a source of pride. You have this in your garden, these birds have found you, and they're saying, thank you, I'm gonna come in and spread these seeds, and you'll have juniper babies all over the place now. But this is a great plant for our area. It's got some high salt tolerance, and that's an issue with a lot of folks. It is a host plant for the cedar quince rust. Not that it affects that plant, but it affects another plant down the line, and we'll talk about that, because I'll tell you my story of I knew better but tried anyway. Bald cypress trees, Taxodium disticum, great if you have low-lying areas. Most of the plants I'm talking about today, this isn't necessarily plants you're going to put in your yard. You may if you have the space to do that, but not a traditional landscape. But if you're advising folks, or you're taking people on these walking tours through natural areas, you want to be able to expand on, why is this plant so great? What's its function? What's it here for? And then just celebrate it, even if it's just to appreciate the beauty of it. Go up and touch it, kind of see the uniqueness of its needles or whatnot. Look at the knees. Why are the knees there? What's the purpose of that? Stabilization and air exchange. This is the deciduous conifer, which is kind of interesting, right? Because we tend to think of conifers as being all evergreens, but no, there are deciduous ones out there. Now I put the dawn redwood as a comparison. These Believe it or not, at one point in time, there were bald cypress trees right outside this window, and that's what that picture is on the left-hand side. And then there's a dawn redwood, not native to us, out in the butterfly garden. And nurseries sometimes can get them. I had it where they delivered dawn redwoods. I'm not knocking them. It's just they look so similar in a pot. You know, if you don't have the reference point of where they are in nature as your guide, it's very easy to make a mistake with that. But dawn redwoods, if you look closely at that picture, their needles are across from each other. They're opposite on the branch. And if you look at the bald cypress up in that left-hand corner, it's a little wild and crazy. It's a little more of a whorled effect, so it's not as clean of a line of the leaflets around across from each other. But they're both deciduous. They both have a lot of characteristics that are similar on just visual observation. Red maples, like I mentioned, this is one of the first pollen sources, nectar sources for our bees. They tolerate just about everything. I mean, it's a tough plant. It's a bottomland hardwood plant. And bottomlands are kind of like that area just up from a swamp. So they're very tolerant of extreme conditions, from it being very dry to it being very wet and everything in between. So they make excellent street trees, urban trees, because of just the fluctuations we get in those environments. So you can make maple syrup out of red maples, but it takes 40 gallons of red maple sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. I always find it interesting. You could do foraging classes, and you can go out and harvest native plants and eat them. It's amazing to me how much you have to harvest in order to have something substantial from it. So it's hard work. It makes me think back all, hundreds of years back, thousands of, how did they eat? How much work that was to gather everything. Hackberry gets underappreciated. They're like, it's a little trash tree. I don't like hackberry. Let me tell you about hackberry. It supports some of the coolest butterflies out there, right? It is what do I want to say? It's kind of like the grocery store of sorts for all these different types of Lepidoptera moths and butterflies. Like there's so many that can find something to eat in that tree. This is one that's in the back of the butterfly garden. Simply for its wildlife value, I think, is why why it's an important tree. Sometimes a good ID, if you're not sure what the plant is, it gets this hackberry nipple gall on the leaves. So it just looks like a bunch of little like little bubbles, I would call them bubbles on the leaf there, and that could be a good field ID for you. Pretty fast growing, pretty tall tree, up to 60 feet. Black gum? Uh-oh. Black gum's not a favorite, huh? Ruh-roh. Okay. Let me tell you a little love. Let me give you a little love about the black gum, the Nyssa sylvatica, right? Again, an excellent tree for wildlife. The flowers are fairly insignificant. Like, you don't see them, they don't stand out as much. But if you stand under one when it's in bloom, the buzzing that you hear, you're just like, what's going on? And you just see clouds of insects just coming to visit those flowers. So excellent for a wildlife source. The birds like the fruits as well. And it's a beautiful tree in the fall. That red color is just a standout. And there's a lot of cultivars out there now those plants were chosen because of their fall color, right? They weren't engineered or anything. It's just that someone was out in the wild and was like, that particular plant is the most beautiful red I've ever seen in my life. Like, I want to propagate that and keep that going. That is a quality I want to really highlight. So they can be very stunning. They are dioecious. I like pointing that out because, sometimes you're buying a plant for the fruits, and you're like, how come this has never fruited for me? It's like, oh man, you got the male plant, because sometimes that's what the trade does. Berries can be considered messy or something to, from an aesthetic quality. So they tend to put the males out there because there's no fruit you have to deal with. But some of us love to have the full experience of what that plant is. Yes, ma'am.
But mine is not labeled male female.
Yep, that's a great question. It's One of the challenges with that is a lot of these trees have to hit a certain maturity level in order to flower. So unless the nursery that we bought it from tells us, we don't know until it reaches that maturity level. Most of the time you can assume they don't know, or they have propagated a male plant just because of that, less messy kind of appeal. But it's a good question though, because we do get that for sure. I know maybe someone doesn't like them, but I hope you appreciate it for the fall color. Mock-nut hickories. Got to really give a shout out to some of our climax forest species. And these are like your hickories and your oaks. These are the ones that live forever out there. So yeah, look at the big old, I don't know if that's the hickory horn devil. I can't remember now which I've forgot on the spot here which that is, but there's a massive caterpillar for a moth. That's the moth that it is. I might be wrong in saying it's the hickory horn devil, but there is a caterpillar called that is that size and looks like it's from outer space. But hickories are very important just for our climax species, the food source they have for the nuts that different wildlife eat. And we have a few. We don't have many here in the garden, but we have a few hickories spread throughout, mainly in Mirror Lake and a couple in Enchanted Forest. But just high wildlife value. And they get pretty big. They can be very substantial, like statement trees, of course, up to 80 feet tall. And it takes them 25 years to produce fruit. So that's a long time investment and gives you appreciation if you see one fruiting, like how old that tree actually is. American beech, this is more of your understory tree. If you've driven up 64 and you see in the wintertime, everything's all deciduous trees, right? But you see this layer of like the light tan leaves. Could be beech trees. There's other plants in that tree family that it could be, but you could at least safely say like, yep, I know that's something in the beech family that's holding its leaves. And that's called marcescens. So that's your Jeopardy word. That's what you can drop on your friends when it's party time. Like, have y'all ever heard of marcescens? Well, let me tell you about it. Or if you're driving up the road, you can point over and be like, oh, that's a great example of a marcescens over there. In the wintertime, these are pretty easy to ID. They have such distinct buds. They're long and they're pointed and they just stand right out. Like it's an easy field ID. Once you see it once, you're like, yep, I'm pretty sure that's a beech tree. Again, very high wildlife value. Don't see them often. There are areas in Virginia Beach where there's like beech and pawpaw communities. That's a naturally occurring community. So if you're in one of those areas, look for pawpaw too, because they're probably hanging around. They like to associate with each other. Persimmons are so not always appreciated because of the fruit, right? Can be a little messy. However, they have such great wildlife value and some really cool applications outside of just, from the wildlife side of things. They have medicinal qualities to the fruit. The wood is really hard and dense, and you can make like things that get impacted, like billiard cues and stuff, where they're just really excellent for that. I had a group of students way back in the day from ODU taking an ethnobotany course here. So they were like harvesting stuff from our garden. And many of them wanted the fruits from the persimmon because apparently during the Civil War, folks used the fruit to make an invisible ink. So they could kind of share messaging and then it would disappear. It would just fade over time. So I was like, well, that's really fascinating. I love that. So I love how you can relate things back to, the history or how it shapes something that, plants not only just give us oxygen, but they're like allowing us to kind of expand what we're able to do. Again, another dioecious plant. We have many male trees around here. You tend to see them there at Cobblestone Bridge. There's some back by the compound and just kind of sprinkled here and there. The best place to see the fruiting ones are kind of on the water's edge around the back of the wildflower meadow there. Don't eat them. Here's your trick. If you want to pull a trick on somebody, have them eat it when it's on the branch before frost. They'll be like, it'll just make their whole mouth pucker up. And they'll never forget it, and they'll probably never forgive you. But once they fall, they get a frost on it. They tend to be more edible, but still pretty tart, but pretty funny. Sweet Bay magnolia. This is kind of the little diminutive cousin of the big grand southern magnolia. We've got I think there's a Sweet Bay right out here along the edge of Mirror Lake by Admin here that blooms. Everything about it is smaller. It's smaller in stature. It's got smaller, narrow leaves. The flower is smaller, but it still has big fragrance like a big grand magnolia. It is semi-evergreen, which means it depends on its spot. If it's kind of protected in the wintertime from the winds and all, it'll retain its leaves. As it's exposed, it'll probably lose most of its leaves because that's pretty stressful. And it loses leaves, with the wind and cold and just drying out. It's just to protect it. You can flip the leaf over and it has a very white, silvery underside. It also, when you break up the leaf and smell it, it smells very medicinal. It's in a pleasant way. It's herby, kind of medicinal. It is a host plant for our state insect, which is the tiger swallowtail. And there's an example of its caterpillar there on the leaf. So perfectly camouflaged, it'll take you a moment to just kind of find that image because it really blends in well. These are great. They're smaller, so they're great for a landscape setting. You don't really have the leaf issue. Some folks don't. With a big southern magnolia, it's dropping big leaves all the time. You don't really get that with this, so it's a little more user-friendly from a maintenance standpoint. It can tolerate some wet soil, some boggy soil. So maybe you have an area in your yard that's low draining, just low, poor drainage. Great with that. It can do some salt tolerance too if you happen to be on a marshy area and you get some of that wind, or you might get a little bit of flooding from it. It's just a beautiful tree, and the cone is smaller. Like I said, everything about it is just dialed down a couple notches. Swamp Bay. I only bring this up. You may find this in the trade. It'll be specialty like a native plant sale or something like that. But you may encounter it because it's very common in the woods around here. So I wanted to give it a highlight. It's just something you don't see every day in the landscape, but it's a pretty common one if you're walking through some trails. So Swamp Bay is actually related to the avocado. It's just a different species of in that family. Persea is also the genus for avocado. So if you look at the fruits at the bottom left, they look very reminiscent of it, but just like the size of your thumbnail, so tiny. So if you cut it open, you'll see a big pit in the middle, just like an avocado, and just a tiny little smudge of green around that huge pit. So it's the complete opposite of the avocado, where it's smaller pit, lots of flesh to eat. But I think that's kind of fun to show folks. Again, it's a fabulous host plant. This is the Palomede swallowtail, and you can see the little swallowtail guy hanging out on the leaf there, showing off its snake eyes, warning you, don't bother me. I do have some of these in my neighborhood. I live over by Haygood Shopping Center, and just walking through my neighborhood, there's big, beautiful Persea trees that were just left in people's yards, I guess, as they developed the neighborhood so many years ago. So it's really fascinating to see. I know what that tree is. Nobody else has one, but I know what it is. So looks very similar. If it was not in flower, it looks very similar to the Magnolia virginiana. Flip over the leaf, see if it has that white silvery coating on it. If it doesn't, then it's most likely a swamp bay. Also is very fragrant, and it has a little bit of like a pubescence, which is like a fur. Just feels kind of velvety. You can see these little fine hairs on it and feel it feels very velvety. This is horse sugar. This is another plant that's blooming or about to bloom right now, one of those early sources. Hard to it's a tree that colonizes, so it's a little hard sometimes to propagate this plant, but I have seen like the Native Plant Society and their specialty sales offer it. We have a huge patch of it in the Native Plant Garden. The boardwalk goes right through it. So at the right time of year, which is coming up, maybe now, maybe in a week or so, both sides of the boardwalk are just filled with these very fragrant little, they almost look like pussy willow flowers on them. And then you can see a little bee hanging out there. It's a host plant for the king's hair streak, which is this little guy, again, about the size of your thumbnail, maybe a little bit bigger. Hair streaks to me all look alike, but I took this picture and showed it to actually Linda, our butterfly guru here. She's like, oh, I don't recognize it. So we showed it to someone in the Butterfly Society, and they're like, hey, that's a king's hair streak. That's an uncommon butterfly. I'm like, oh, cool. So it got me, that was my introduction into specialists, plants and animals that have that very unique relationship where If that plant was gone, this hair streak would not exist in the state. It's just in the southeast corner. It's more prevalent further south in North Carolina. And again, we're looking at political borders, so that's, that's a fake. Don't look at that, but its range, is just into where its northernmost range is. So I felt it was very special, and it was a great learning lesson for me of, the intricate interconnectedness that we should be paying attention to. Serviceberry, so here's my lesson learned. I remember we started off with the eastern red cedar, and it's a carrier for that quince, the cedar quince rust. So serviceberries are very susceptible to cedar quince rust, so don't plant them right underneath each other. It's just going to go from the cedar tree, bam, right into your serviceberry and mess up all the fruit. And you can see what it does to the fruit there. So it makes it look like Sputnik with all these little fruiting bodies sticking out of it, and it completely ruins all the fruit. The spores get introduced to the flower, which, as the fruit develops, that's what the fungus is developing in the fruit and just completely ruins it. However, if you don't have that nearby, the eastern red cedar, this is an outstanding ornamental native plant that serves everybody to me. This is a one-stop shop. It's got, it's a food source for wildlife, food source for pollinators, food source for us. The berries are absolutely delicious. You can make pies out of them it's like a tart blueberry is what it tastes like. High antioxidants like a blueberry. It's just, to me, it is the plant. If you have space for one plant in your yard, one tree, one large shrub, make it a serviceberry. I think you'd appreciate the fact that you can enjoy it from a food standpoint as well. Autumn Brilliance is the most common one in the trade. It's a hybrid, just two natives from two different regions in the South being crossed. Sometimes you find it as a tree, sometimes you find it as a multi-stem shrub. It can take some part shade. I mean, it's a very tolerant tree. It's just excellent. And anything in the Rosaceae family is susceptible to just about every possible disease that's out there. They are very susceptible. And there's a great deal of, it's a huge family of plants. So just something to be aware of. Serviceberries, already gave them a shout out, but this is what they look like right now. It's prime time for the serviceberries. Those flowers are edible. So if you want to do a fancy little salad for your friends, you could sprinkle those little flowers on there if you want. Excellent for the pollinators. So many different possibilities of tree sizes out there and leaf color and all that. So there's seems to be one for every possible planting space you have. They even have these small little weeping ones. This is called Ruby Falls, the one in the bottom right corner there. Very pretty. It is in the bean family, so you get those seed pods hanging in the late summer. Pretty fast growing, likes well-drained soil. It's very beautiful, very ornamental, but again, has a lot of function that carries over. And it blooms, so I'll point out, it blooms at 4 years old. So if you buy a tiny little twig from the Forest Service or something, it'll take a minute for it to get old enough to bloom. And by the way, this summer we are giving away these trees in our children's garden. So put it on your calendar. Coming up soon. Fringe tree, another beautiful show-stopping native plant that has outstanding fragrance, just a unique flower. I mean, to me, it's a prize if you have this in your yard. Everyone's going to stop and be like, what is that? That is awesome. There is an Asian fringe tree that we have all about the garden, but it in no way has this showy of a flower. Like this is the one that really stands out. It is related to the olive family. So the fruit looks like little olives in the corner. You can kind of see that. And it is prime food for birds. I've got a mockingbird that in my yard that has staked out this plant and nobody else can share it. It is his and his alone. Again, these are dioecious. And in the trade, they do label them. Actually, they have them labeled as male and female, and different cultivar names trigger which is which kind of thing. This is full sun or part shade. So the more sun you give it, the more beautiful it's going to be. There is a stunning one in the meadow that's out in full sun, and it is just the perfect low lollipop like you would draw as a kid, if you were drawing a landscape. Perfect tree for it. have to include dogwoods. It's our state flower and state tree. That would be terrible if I, didn't bring that little guy up. Dogwoods are having a moment. They're very sensitive to environmental stress, so we do pay attention to that here at the garden. Just track it. It's not anthracnose, which is great. That's a very devastating disease to dogwood trees, but mostly for our trees, it's just environmental stress, and it's that cumulative effect of environmental stress, right? So all these summers where we have no rain in August and it's 1,000 degrees out, over time, that really knocks those trees, it stresses them out to where they just weaken a little bit, as they go. So if a funk were to come along, they're pretty easy targets because they're already weakened, and they're a little more susceptible to that. But for the most part, it's just the cumulative effect of environmental stress. They're about to bloom, if not in bloom right now. They had a lot of historical use. Their wood is pretty dense, so they were made spoons and bowls and things out of them. High wildlife value. Those fruits on there, those red fruits are just like nutrition bombs for wildlife. Very, very good for them to have. So interestingly, the petals we see are not true petals. They're bracts. So they're just modified to look like a petal, and all the flowers are in that tiny little circle. So there's probably 15 or so little flowers in the middle that the pollinators visit. The more shade you give it, the better. The more sun. It may bloom and look more floriferous, but that's really stressful for that tree. Like it'll knock a few years off of its lifespan because it's just not intended to be. It's a fringe tree. It likes to be on the fringe of a forest where it's getting some sun but getting protected from that really hot afternoon sun. And this is who hangs out in them. I was fortunate in the Enchanted Forest many years ago, watching this photographer going bonkers. They're just setting up just right under a low-hanging dogwood branch, and sure enough, they had found a hummingbird nest. I have no idea how they zoned in and saw that because it's so tiny, and the eggs look like just little jelly beans. But that's who's hanging out in our plants, and why we want to have a native plant landscape for them. And of course, beautiful fall color and those really pretty berries. I'll tell you a nice color combination. It was accidental. At my house, I have a dogwood out in the front, and I have a really late blooming aster right under it. So I have this beautiful purple aster contrasting against the red of the dogwood. And, I have folks come on, they're like, man, that's so pretty. I'm like, oh, I planned that. I'm like, surely I did not. It was just, hey, I have this space. Let me put this aster here. And then over time, I'm like, wow, that really looks good. It was just serendipitous. Red chokeberry, fabulous little shrub, small tree, very fragrant flowers, excellent fall color. They have berries on them that the birds like, but they're kind of like last resort fruit for them, food for them. So they have to go through this freeze-thaw cycle before they're really palatable to the bird, so they persist. So you can, on the flip side of that is they're persisting through the winter, and you can enjoy them as an ornamental attribute of the plant. But the birds at the end, they're pretty desperate, and they're like, all right, I'm going to eat this. And then all of a sudden the robins have wiped out every possible berry on there. They call it chokeberry because it's pretty stringent. If you eat it, it'll make you choke. The next one is Aronia melanocarpa, and I have seen this plant used for juice making. They used some, Trader Joe's way back in the day had a chokeberry juice that they sold, and it came from this plant. It was pretty tart. It was like cranberry times 1,000. It was perk you right up. They both have very similar growth habits, and they're both native to this range. Although the black chokeberry is a little more towards the Piedmont side of things, but it still does very well here. Very pollinator friendly, again, with the fruits. Blooms this time of year, and when you plant them in mass, you can actually appreciate the fragrance. It's strong enough to carry on the breeze, and sitting nearby, you're like, wow, that's very pleasant. It makes for a nice experience. American holly, got to have the evergreens to provide, protection for the birds or other animals, other little furry guys that need to hide from maybe a hawk or something else coming through. It's a great screen. I have a few that help screen my neighbor's driveway. And they're pretty huge. They 30 to 40 feet. The state champion is on the campus of Hampton University, I believe. I don't know if anyone's been out there to see it, but we went as a group one time to see it, and I would have never guessed it looked like a huge evergreen oak tree. It was just massive. I'm used to seeing them in a landscape setting where they're, leaves from top to bottom, not pruned up to be a tree. And it was a very impressive specimen to see. Again, hollies are dioecious, so you have the male, female on there. Lots of cultivars, from variegated leaves to yellow berries to shorter, only going to grow about 5 feet high. And just remember, if you read a tag and it says it's a dwarf is relative. It's not always going to stay. It's more a reflection of its growth rate that, it doesn't grow as fast as, say, the straight species would. So in time, it may stay around like 5 feet if that's what it says, but given long enough period for it to grow, it'll definitely start growing beyond that and start achieving a higher. But it's just such a slow rate. We probably wouldn't notice it, but that's just the caution with dwarf. It won't stay like that forever. And again, berries, become palatable after several freeze-thaw cycles. And sometimes they ferment. There was some stories you guys probably, maybe you've heard it. They had the Iliagnus fruit bushes on the interstate and had to remove them because the berries would ferment, the birds would eat them, and they'd get a little like loopy and they're flying and there'd be some car incident. So had to remove them. But the birds get drunk, maybe on purpose. Deciduous hollies are showstoppers in the winter. These are right across from the children's garden and just absolutely gorgeous. Again, because it's this dioecious, they are very clear at pointing out who's the male pollinator, who's what's the female cultivar, and the timing. So you can synchronize when both flowers are blooming at the same time, so you get that cross-pollination. And I love this, 48 species of birds eat the berries. That's a lot of support, and that's excellent. And plus, it's stunning for you, in the wintertime, your neighbors may have nothing going on but some evergreen meatballs in their front yard, and this is like a ray of sun right there, like, wow, look at that. Spice bush, I love promoting butterflies, the pollinators, as you can see, but spice bush is a really important one for the spice bush swallowtail. This is one that was out in the butterfly garden. It beautiful. I love plants that flower first, so you can really appreciate that aesthetic, and then they produce their leaves. Like there's no competition. It's like you can appreciate every single stage that it goes through the season. It is dioecious and deciduous, grows up to about 15 feet. Pretty sensitive to drought, so you want to make sure if you do plant it, it's in a pretty, has consistent moisture in the soil. It can tolerate some part shade. The leaves are fragrant. When you break it up, it smells, I say medicinal, but I don't mean that in the wrong way. It's just very herbal. It's pleasant though. You can make teas from it. Usually like open forest area where it's bright, but not necessarily direct sun. And it has a stunning yellow fall color too. And there's the little caterpillar up there in the upper right. So it folds the leaf over like a taco, and then you open it up, and there's the little caterpillar in there. I will warn you, sometimes there's spiders in there, and you're like, whoa, big spider. Pawpaw, now we mentioned that with the beech trees, but pawpaws are blooming right now. They have a very unique brown velvety looking bell-shaped flower. It is the host plant for the zebra swallowtail. It is deciduous, so right now all you see are these flowers on it. They are pollinated, I believe, by like beetles and flies. They attract a very different pollinator to them. The flowers kind of have a fetid fragrance to them, which is very attractive to a different set of pollinators. It does colonize. There is a fruit that is edible if you can get to it before the wildlife, the possums and the raccoons get to them. They love them, and they seem to know exactly when it's ripe. And it is the largest edible fruit native to North America. They make ice cream out of it. Kentucky State was even trying to do a breeding program where they were was to make shelf-stable fruit so it could actually become a grocery store item. I don't know where they are in that program, but because when it gets ripe, it goes quick. It has no shelf life whatsoever. It's kind of mushy. It's described as being banana-like in flavor, but custard-like in texture, I think. It's a little, not for me. And there's festivals. I think there's a pawpaw festival over on the peninsula somewhere, if folks have been to it. Okay. And there's a song about picking up pawpaw and putting it in your pocket. Lots of fun with this plant. Winged sumac, outstanding fall color. It's a food source for our native bluebirds. They come and just gorge on those on the berries in the fall. It is related. You can make a sumac tea out of it, which is very like lemonade-y. However, it is in the cashew family. So if you have nut allergies, you just need to be aware that there's that association. We see it a lot around the fringes, fringe forested areas here in the garden. And I mean, it's a beautiful, very beautiful plant. I think it should get more, there should be more applications for it in the landscape.
Is it tea leaves or berries?
It's usually the berry, like the berries and the fruit, I think. I'm sorry, the flowers that they use. Calicarpa americana, American beautyberry, easy to grow, pollinator hotspot. Those flowers, they are more insignificant. I mean, that's a close-up, so they look pretty showy and beautiful, but they're pretty insignificant. When you look at the bush itself, that's not the first thing you see. Really, what's the showstopper about it are those fruits. That pink fuchsia color is just so beautiful. What we've noticed here at the garden is, there's Asian varieties that are very popular in the trade, but the birds will go for this first, then they go for the Asian species. So there is a definite preference that they have, but it's excellent pollinator plant. The berries are edible. They absolutely taste like nothing. They have no flavor whatsoever. It's completely insipid. The boughs of the branches, they have a insect repellent quality to them. The two chemicals are there. So a lot of farmers used to use them to help with their livestock, help to, on horses and stuff to repel the biting flies. It's a beautiful, I think it's about 6 feet high and 6 feet wide. You can cut it back, let it flush back out. I don't know. It's an overall really great landscape plant. A lot of viburnums. I just picked out this particular one, Viburnum nudum. It has berries that change in color from white to pink to blue. I thought that was very, very pretty. The flowers actually stink pretty badly, and that's because they are bringing in those those beetles and flies and pollinators like that. So we have a lot of different viburnums to choose from. Most of them are deciduous, about 10 feet tall or so, and they can tolerate a wide range of soil. So, they can be clay friendly, sun, shade, you name it. It can pretty much tolerate anything. Really dry pine, duff, they grow well in that. Hearts of Augustin, one of the most unique fruits I think nature has out there, putting fuchsia and red together. That might not be what a landscape designer would be like, oh, those colors don't go together. Well, nature says they do, so we're all good. You'll never notice the flowers. They're just so tiny. It's these berries that really stand out. The cedar waxwings, the robins, they'll come and just decimate the plant in the fall. It's just such a beautiful plant. Very open, airy habit. It is somewhat evergreen, and it just kind of arches. It's very graceful. Elderberry, a lot of uses for elderberry, right? There's medicinal uses for it. It helps your immune system. You see that advertised. You can make syrup with it. This tends to grow in sunny, like drainage ditch, think drainage ditch kind of environment where it's low and swampy. These guys thrive in that. But they can also do traditional garden soil settings too. If you go to our pollinator garden, which is just next to the butterfly house, there is a elderberry that we rescued from the wild that's probably 12 feet tall. It is huge and stunning and full of white flowers and these berries in the fall and just tons of wildlife activity, pollinator activity. It's just beautiful. You can make elderberry wine, right? So there's the whole range, syrups, wine, help your immunity. It's win-win. Summer Sweet, this is Clethra omnifolia. This particular cultivar is called Ruby Spice because the straight species is an all white flower. This one has just that little tinge of pink on it, which is lovely. This brings in the who's who of pollinators. If you want to do a pollinator study of who's visiting your yard, plant a bunch of these. It blooms in July. It's hot. You're out on your porch hanging out in the evenings. You have this lovely little fragrance coming through. You can just watch all this activity. You see some of the coolest insects you've ever seen on them. They tolerate just about everything from some salt spray to soggy, wet soil, full sun, shade. I mean, you can throw everything but the kitchen sink at it and the thing will just thrive. It's a very tough plant. Buttonbush, we sell a little one called Sugar Shack usually in our plant sale, which is real fun because it's cute little flowers. They look like little Sputniks. The tiger swallowtails, I don't know, it's a magnet. If you plant this, tiger swallowtails will find this flower and come visit it. Typically it gets about 6 feet tall. We have some that are in standing water year round, and I mean like a foot of standing water, but they can also tolerate just your classic garden soil. But if you have an area where you get, it rains heavy and you have some standing water, or the soil gets a little soupy and stays that way for a few days, this is an excellent solution for that. Virginia Sweet Spire, spring bloomer that has these very, stand out little panicles or not really panicles, but these little spikes of flowers on them. It is fragrant, excellent for pollinators. Very tough plant. I used to see this planted in median strips around town. So that's a pretty harsh area. You've got asphalt, all around you. You have this narrow little strip that you can grow in, and you get all the runoff from the street on it, and they just thrive. They do great. They sucker, but not at a rate that you couldn't control. Like you can totally get in there and just pull a few out and be like, no, I'd rather you just stay right here. But if you bear in mind that it will sucker, it's a great way to fill in a troublesome space. Something that's like shady and wet, got some soggy soil. But also just regular soil in the front in mass is a very stunning show. Fall color is kind of get multiple seasons out of this plant. Spirea tomentosa, I threw this in because who knew we had a native spirea? We always look at the Asian, the bridal wreath one that blooms very early. There's some out in our sensory garden. But we have a native spirea. This fuchsia color is very pretty, stand out. It's got fuzzy leaves. This is out in our children's garden. It is native to the coastal plain, and there are some specialty nurseries that sell it. I'm assuming it's gained popularity just because native plants in general have gained popularity. So there's probably more options to find it now than before. It only gets about 4 feet tall, so it's a very manageable size plant. I have some in my landscape at home, and I've noticed that branches come and go. Like they'll die out, but then you have a new flush coming out from the base. So it kind of regenerates itself every few years. Coastal leucothoe, this is Leucothoe axillaris, fabulous evergreen, low growing, I consider it like a ground cover-ish plant because it'll just completely cover an area and make it look very lush. Got bell-shaped flowers, kind of like a blueberry. They're all in the same family. Moist soil, but well drained. Doesn't like to have soggy feet. So something that comes and goes, like just like if it's by like a downspout or something, and that water comes, flushes out, but drains pretty quickly. Great for that. A lot of good value with that, but it's also just very lush looking. I think it does something for your mental health. Blueberries. So we have a bunch of different types of blueberries. I was thinking when you guys are walking your trails and doing some interpretation, you might have like patches of low, blueberry-like bushes or plants there, and you're curious what you might have. If it's not in fruit and you just have the leaves, if you turn over the leaf and look, kind of have to look very closely at that image, but there's little golden dots. Those are glandular dots on the underside of the leaf. So if it has that, it's a huckleberry. If it doesn't, it's a blueberry. And you can smudge it. If you're not sure about it, you can smudge it on a piece of white paper. You can smudge it on your pants. Be like, hey, that yellow streak, I know that's a huckleberry. That's a type of Gay Lusacea. Just kind of fun, something to do. in the field. And it's interactive, right? So if you're leading a group, everybody can grab a leaf and smudge it or look at it under a loop and see all those little glandular dots there. It's very interactive. If you want to do blueberries for fruit production in your own yard, you need to have at least 3 cultivars planted together so you get really good cross-pollination with that. And you get better fruit set. Climax, Premier, and Tiff Blue tend to be the best ones for our area. And of course, we already talked about that specialist bee, so you guys knew that. Shout out to our native azaleas. They're coming into bloom right now. Remember I talked about that swallowtail. You can see those plant parts sticking way out where the stamens are and where the pistil is, and all it's way out there. So you can kind of visualize how those butterfly wings are flapping against that and moving that pollen around. Surprisingly, our native azaleas love full sun. The more sun you give them, the more floriferous they are. They love it. They love well-drained soil. Just like the Asian azaleas we have here, although they're just more sun tolerant. And a lot of them are fragrant. They can have kind of like a candy, like cotton candy smell, very sweet. Some are a little spicy. But I think we have like 3 or 4 native species here to the coastal plain. There's a big one in bloom just over by Rose Garden Hall right now. It's a Piedmont native, but beautiful. And you can see it's in full sun, no shade, just full of pink flowers. And they all have this kind of like pink, whitey flush of color to them. Here's a dwarf one. Now there are some naturally occurring hybrids I wanted to point out. The Austrinum is a yellow flowered native azalea that's native just like in North Carolina, and then Atlanticum, they can cross, so you have this perfect little ball-shaped azalea with yellow flowers and flushes of pink on the tube. Very fragrant too. There's a bunch of these in the back of the wildflower meadow that you can just walk back there and see a ton of them. They were all naturally occurring, and we were able to get some. And there's a swallowtail doing its thing. Swamp azalea, despite its name, it doesn't grow in the swamp. It's on fringes of the swamp. It needs good drainage. And this blooms July, so this is June, July time frame when these butterflies are, when it's their season. And groundsel. We're in marshy areas here. We have a lot of saltwater marshes, and this is a very common plant you see there. It's actually in the aster family. It's the only woody member in the aster family. And you see this bloom in the fall. These little cream-colored flowers. It gets about 6 to 12 feet tall, I would say on average, but definitely a signature plant of the saltwater marshes around here, or brackish marshes. And just a few vines to talk about. We have native wisteria. The Asian wisteria is starting to come into bloom right now. You might be seeing that in some of the roadsides, some of the backwoods areas around town. But we do have a native one. It's called Amethyst Falls. It has a much smaller panicle. It's not as fragrant, and it blooms after the Asian ones bloom. Crossvine, Bignonia, beautiful vine that wants to go up high and tall and be in the trees, but not damage the trees. It's one of those where they coexist very well. Coral honeysuckle, that coral color is a standout. You can grow it just about everywhere. It's not a vine that twists. It more kind of rambles and scrambles about, so you have to control it a little bit. You need to tie it off and guide it where you need to go. So if you had like a split rail fence, like we have it growing in the meadow, we've trained it to go, down those rails. And then passion flower. Very tropical looking plant to be native here in Virginia. It's a host plant for the fritillary caterpillar or butterfly. Does have an edible fruit. It's just messy and you don't get much out of it, honestly. And it also has a mind of its own. It will grow wherever it wants to grow. Yes, ma'am. No. I'm glad you are. That is a good question. I'm not sure the toxicity of them. So the question is, are these plants toxic to dogs? There's been some understanding that they are. And honestly, I don't know. I'd have to look that up to see. I was just thinking most of the time, once they start to grow, it's just the woody, you could have some leaves. I just don't know, honestly. My neighbor's dog's never chewed on mine, but that's their dog. Okay, I'm going to get on the soapbox. I'm going to end it up here. Let me just reinforce some concepts here. If you guys are followers of Doug Tallamy, if you've read his books, seen his lectures, this is all very familiar stuff. Our gardens are at the forefront for conservation right now, right? We have a lot of fragmented ecosystems, so it's very important that we use our home gardens as a tool for that, to help connect things, because it can make a difference. And plants in your yard, ornamental plants that you put in your yard, can function just like the natural communities that we're missing, that are gone, to development. We've lost these natural areas. So your garden can kind of sub in for those natural sweeps of plants. And it's important to think about your garden and how it connects to ecology, and to celebrate that interconnectedness, to sit back and watch nature, enjoy what you planted in your yard, and learn a little something, and celebrate that and share it, with folks around. I think that is your bragging right, is what kind of life am I bringing to my garden? How am I supporting the local ecosystem, as opposed to saying I have the rarest plant that's out there in the world, or I have the only one that blooms purple. I think that's what we should start talking about, is what is it supporting, and to be proud about that. So thank you, guys. A couple books. And then I guess this is your break time.
Okay. I don't know if this will make the recording, but oh, we'll get it. We are going to break in a minute. But before we break, I know at the end of class, there's going to be a flurry of activity with people wanting to race out to the logo wear table. So I want to forewarn you, at the end of class, we have presents for you today, because we love you and because it's setting you up for next week's class. Okay. So before you leave today, make sure you stop by the table and see Barb, who will give you presents. Okay. And they're important because they'll help you for next week. Do you want me to give them the heads up on the other present? Susan has a present too. My students, when I was teaching, whenever I said I have presents for you, one of them would always look at me and go, are they presents we want, or are they your presents? I assure you, Barb has a present you'll want. So at the end of class, if you would just stay put for a minute, we'll take care of presents, and then we'll set you loose on logo wear. So I have 10:25 right now. Why don't we plan on about a 10-minute break, and we'll see you back about 25 till 11. Because it's time for another commercial. I think this is our last commercial, though. Yeah, and this is a good one because it has to do with our Arbor Day project. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Bush, who is going to tell you all about our Arbor Day festivities.
Thank you. So now that you've heard about all these wonderful things about trees, I'm going to tell you about a project, a tree project. Arbor Day is actually a national holiday or day designated Arbor Day by the Arbor Day Foundation, and the official Arbor Day is the last Friday of April. But many localities, including Norfolk, celebrate on a different day. Our Arbor Day celebration is the second Saturday in October, because fall is the best time to plant trees in this area. Okay, so mark that on your calendars. This is a different type of a project. It's a one-day event. And Arbor Day celebration is held at Lafayette Park. It's put on by the Norfolk Tree Commission and Keep Norfolk Beautiful. We are there to help them with the tree adoption activity, which is only one part of the Arbor Day celebration. There'll also be vendors. There'll be speeches by the mayor or somebody else from City Hall, awards given. There'll be demonstrations, activities for kids, food trucks, and our fall plant sale. So it's all going on at the same time at Lafayette Park. You can volunteer for both the plant sale and the Arbor Day activity. What we do is we'll have some people come early to help set up, get the trees off the truck, put them on the tables. Then we have several people that help the public select the proper tree for their location. And some of the things that Theresa was talking about this morning are things that you'll need to know about Do you have a shady spot, a sunny spot? Do you have a big yard, a little yard? What kind of a tree are you looking for? Are you looking for ornamental, blah, blah, blah? So we have information sheets that will be sent out before the day to give you a little bit of information so you can help people select the proper tree. And what else do we do? After the sale is over, it's usually from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. At the end of the day, we load up whatever trees we haven't sold and they go back to the tree farm. In case you're wondering where do all these wonderful trees come from, they come from the Norfolk Tree Farm, which is actually in Chesapeake, but that's where the trees are grown. And sometimes we're lucky enough to get invited down there to help them repot trees. And if we do get an invitation, I highly recommend that you sign up for it because it's a lot of fun. Okay, do we have any questions? Yes. It's usually the second Saturday in October. If that changes, we'll let everybody know. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Let's talk about mushrooms. How many folks here have even thought beyond seeing the mushroom in the ground and they're like, I wonder what that little guy is all about? Has anybody really? Okay, good. I like that. We're in the midst of a shroom boom. Mushrooms are having a moment. Everybody is about them. From the decor you see at like Marshall's and TJ Maxx and everything online, all there's some Netflix movies that are excellent to watch. So let's talk about them because they are an important indicator of soil health and forest health. And I don't know what I'm doing to cause problems. So who are our fungal friends? We're just going to talk about mushrooms. They have their own kingdom. Long ago, they used to be lumped in with plants, but it's their own kingdom. They have interesting characteristics where they're neither plant nor animal, but they have characteristics of both in a way. They're non-vascular. They don't have xylem and phloem. They reproduce by spores, and we know that there are some plants that reproduce by spores. They have a chitin-based cell wall, and that's an animal characteristic. So chitin is the protein that makes up the shells in the exoskeleton of insects, lobsters, crabs, so that's an animal characteristic. But they have no chlorophyll, so they are not photosynthesizing at all. So very interesting creatures here. Nature's curious creation is how I like to think of them. I just want to give you an overview of the kingdom fungi. It's like 6+ phyla and growing. It's I can't keep pace with it. But I just want to point out how common fungi is in our everyday life. You folks are eating cheese today, and cheese is a product of fungi. You may be dealing with an athlete's foot issue. That's a product of fungi. You may go home tonight and enjoy some morels with a nice glass of wine. Well, you've got some fermentation going on there. That's from a yeast, that's a fungi. And of course, the truffle is a fungus itself. You may have some trees outside that are covered in beautiful lichen. That's a fungal relationship that you see right there as well. So everywhere, somebody might be taking penicillin today. That's a fungal component as well. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want the awareness, like they are in our life just about every step of the way. It's not just the mushrooms or if your bread goes bad and turns black, they're everywhere. The good and the bad. So mushrooms, when we talk about them, we classify them based on the substrate, like what are they growing on or where are they growing? Sometimes you see them growing on dead material, like a dead log, a branch that fell that's dead. They are considered saprobes. They're saprophytic. They're recycling. They're just breaking down dead material. Mainly that lignin, I hinted at that earlier in the last presentation. They are there to break down lignin. Even termites can't break down lignin. They have a fungus in their system that helps them, in their guts, that helps them break down lignin. So it is tough. Sometimes they're parasitic. We see it growing on the side of a tree, which can be problematic, right? That's an indicator that something's going on in the core of that tree and we need to keep an eye on it. Sometimes they're parasitic on other plants. Fungal diseases that affects our plants like botrytis and some of these other little things. That's a fungal issue. Sometimes there's fungus on us. And then there's the mutualistic. These are beneficial relationships that happen in nature, mainly between plants and a fungus and happening underground. And then there's, which we call mycorrhizal, that's that association with roots. And we'll deep dive into that to explain it a little bit more. And then there's lichens. That's a fungal association. It's mutualistic between an algae or a cyanobacteria or both. Very unique organism. And that's an example of two types of lichen on that branch there on the right. So we have a foliose, kind of looks like leaf lettuce on there. And then you have fruticose, which kind of looks shrubby-like. So what exactly is a mushroom when we talk mushrooms? Sometimes fungus and mushroom are interchangeable, but we'll be very clear so that we'll eliminate that confusion. So a mushroom is the reproductive structure of a fungus that lives underground. So the living organism is what we don't see underground. That's what's going through the soil. That's what's hanging out in the dead wood that we don't see. And the mushroom is simply the fruiting body. So when that organism is ready to reproduce, start that next generation, it sends up its reproductive structure, which is a mushroom. Those spores hit the air and the next generation carries on. Now, not all fungus produces mushrooms. So we're only focusing on the fungus that does. A lot of it does not. And you can think of mushrooms as like an apple on an apple tree. You can pull the apples all day long. You can strip that tree clean of apples, but the tree continues to live. And that's exactly the case with the fungus. So the fungus is underground. That's what's living and growing and spreading. And we can pick the mushrooms all we want, but that organism underground has not been harmed by it. You know, it's that same setup. So when I have fielded questions in the past, like, oh, I'm worried about these mushrooms in my yard. I have kids, I have dogs, you know, I don't like them, you know, whatever. They're like, how can I get rid of them? I'm like, you really can't. You know, it's underground and living and thriving and belongs there. Short of sterilizing the soil, which we would not want to do, that kills everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly in the soil. We don't want to do that because that strips away all the nutrients and the benefits that are there, all those good microbes. So you just kind of have to live with it. I'm sorry. Most of the species, if you think about the phyla that we looked at, are Basidiomycetes and Ascomycetes, and it's a reference to how they reproduce, what their reproductive structures are in where the spores are produced. So that's a little bit of a deeper dive, but I just want to touch the surface on it that, you know, the more you want to learn, you can go down a rabbit hole and never escape. It's just a fascinating subject to study. Interestingly, mushrooms grow by cell expansion, right? So that's just that mushroom, when it starts to grow, has all the cells it's going to need right there, and it can just swell up, kind of like a dry sponge, you know, that's been like shrunk down, and you put it in water and it just bloops, it just plops right up. Yes, ma'am.
The cells larger, or are they like splitting?
The cells are just getting larger. They're not doing cell division. That's why it takes us a long time to grow. We're doing cell division, and that takes a while. So they have all those cells right there, and when there's water present, they just like soak it up and expand. So let's talk about mushroom structure real quick. Lots of different structures to look at. And this is really just to get us all on the same page when you reference something. You have the cap. You know, if we're talking about the classic cap and stalk mushroom, so you have the cap, you have the stalk, which is technically called a stipe, and then you look at the base, and the base can have some characteristics that are helpful in identification. Some of them have gills under the cap, some have tubes and pores under the cap. Some of them, they're folds. They may look like gills, but they're actually just folds. And if you look below here, oh, well, you can't do it on the TV. I alluded to how the spores are developed, what their reproductive structures are for the spores. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see these little like club-like, they have like, well, almost looks like a funky flower right there with the little oblong circles on there. So those are the spores at the top, and that's the structure that generates them. That's Basidiomycetes. Ascomycetes are these club-like structures where the spores are kind of housed internally in there. Not a detail you guys need to know. I'm just giving it to you so you have an awareness of it, but we won't deep dive into that. Here's a real life picture pointing out all those details. The pilus is also known as the cap, the gills, the stipe or the stalk, and then you see the vulva, which is the sac-like. Not all mushrooms have this, but they have a sac-like structure that the stipe originates from. It's almost like an eggshell. You can think of it like an eggshell. You know, some mushrooms underground actually start like a little egg and they pop out and they grow from that, and you still have that little sac that's there. It's just an identifying feature. And the ID books will ask you that, you know, what does the base look like, and give you several options to choose from. And it'll help you start to recognize common species that pop up in our area here. This particular one is a type of Amanita. My pronunciation of mushrooms is, everyone's a little different, and I know y'all have botanical nomenclature as an earlier topic, I think, and botanical nomenclature varies. It's not based on classic Latin, so don't get hung up if you're saying it wrong. Just say it. We all know what we're talking about, I think, so we'll disarm the Latin part of it. So this is the Amanita. Amanita tends to have some type of sac-like base that they grow out of, and it'll vary what it looks like. So a couple definitions to talk about. So when we're talking about the fungus is the living organism underground, what does that mean? So it's basically this thread-like network of cells called mycelia. Mycelium is the singular, mycelia is the plural. So it's just this network. If you've ever dug in the dirt, dug into some mulch, and you see these white threads kind of going through all the chips or within the soil, that's the mycelium, that's the living organism, that's the fungus that is going to produce a mushroom. Hyphae are just the individual cells, right? So if you kind of imagine a long string, and looking at that long string has these little individual rectangles connected to each other. That's what a fungal cell looks like. So here's some examples. Have y'all seen this before? Is this familiar to most of you when you've been digging around? So this is what you're looking at. This is that fungus. So what that fungus is doing right here is breaking down complex materials into simpler materials. It's helping to, make or create the components of soil, this organic matter that we all strive for in our soil, breaking down the lignin or breaking down other dead material, cellulose, whatever, into components that are simpler that form soil. Let's go to this picture. So how does a mushroom form? What's that life cycle look like? So let's start. You have the big mushroom. It's up. It's beautiful. Underneath it has gills. This particular specimen has gills. So you have the little spores that are coming off, and they're tiny. Sometimes if you get the right angle of light and you hit the timing just right, you can see, just like pollen, clouds of these spores coming off the gills and just floating away in the wind. We are breathing spores in every time, all the time, outside, indoors. There's spores everywhere. They've done studies with airplanes and having like sticky pads on the wings, and how many spore species can you find up there? Millions of them, right? They're just everywhere. So the spores are floating through the air. They land on the dirt somewhere, or some acceptable environment. Maybe it's on a piece of dead wood, and then it starts to grow. The environment is right for it. So just like a plant sets out roots, the spore starts growing in the mycelium, right? Starts producing hyphae and starts producing that mycelium underground. So as it's growing and it's doing its thing, it's digesting some of this, dead material underground. It's growing and getting stronger and bigger, just like a plant does, right? So as a plant produces more energy and gets stronger and bigger, it has the energy to start to reproduce. That takes a lot of energy out of an organism to reproduce. So it's built up its stores. It's time to reproduce. It's complex. And my understanding is scientists don't exactly understand all the mechanisms involved in producing a mushroom, like, that mating process, I guess, underground. It's sometimes just referred to as compatible strains come together of individual fungal species, like individuals of the same species come together, and they just start like growing and producing what's called a hyphal knot. It's just a concentrated grouping of mycelium that starts to form the basis of your mushroom, and it just goes from there. So like a little hyphal knot, like a little collection of mycelia that starts to differentiate and form the stipe, form the cap, or whatever form that mushroom is going to take. And it just gets bigger and bigger because the cells are expanding. It's all contingent on environmental conditions. How much food is in the system for the fungus to feed on and to get strong and to have the energy reserves? What's the pH like? What's the temperature like? The ambient temperature, humidity, moisture content in the soil. All of these factors play into when and if the fungus is going to produce that mushroom. So, some years we have great fruiting years, and some years we have terrible years, and that's because it all boils down to moisture. The past few years, our Augusts have been incredibly dry. September is your typical mushroom season. That's the hot spot. That's when you're usually going to see tons of things happening out there. We've had very poor mushroom seasons because we just haven't had the moisture consistently when we've needed it. So you might not see something, looking out at your backyard, you're like, I've never seen mushrooms out there. And then all of a sudden the conditions are right. And you're like, wow, look at all of them. They're just laying in wait, just waiting for the right conditions to happen. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm going to demystify them a little bit today too, is part of it. Now I know there's a tree steward program. So how do knowing about mushrooms and fungus relate to that program, right? Where you're going out and you're looking at trees, somebody may call you out, or you're going to a property to inspect something, or you're doing a tour and you see some mushrooms that are popping up, and someone might say, is that good or bad? Is that poisonous? What do I do with that? And what I want y'all's takeaway to be is to know the beneficial role they play. Can they tell you about the health of a tree or the health of an area? Fungus is integral. It's so important. It allows plants to thrive. It helps them get nutrients so that even if they live or are growing in tough conditions, that fungus underground that has formed a mycorrhizal association with it is helping it get the nutrients it needs to thrive. It's all connected. I'm sure most of you or some of you have heard of this wood wide web theory, where everything underground, all those roots are connected, and it's through fungal connections that all the trees, all the plants are connected. But you want to be able to tell somebody, hey, that mushroom that you see, that's evidence of a mycorrhizal association going on. So that's good to see that. That makes you aware that there's a lot of healthy things going on in the soil. You might see something at the base of a tree and it looks like it might be in the soil, but it's at the base of the tree. And you're like, I know that, that mushroom could actually be both parasitic and saprophytic, meaning it's just breaking down dead stuff. But you're looking at a live tree and you're like, you know what, I think you might have white rot in that tree. You're going to want to have it evaluated or just keep an eye on it. Like this is a tree that in time could be a problem. Not that you need to take it down, that's, but you'll keep that in mind for future management of it. So that's why I think it's really important. If you want a thriving garden, you need healthy soil, and fungus is a huge component of that healthy soil. So the sequence of rotting mushrooms, of mushrooms like, breaking down rotting things and then they themselves breaking down are essential to the health of the forest. It produces phosphorus, zinc, potassium, all these essential minerals are released that the plants need to thrive. And the fungal mycelia, they mitigate a multi-directional transfer of nutrients between plants, right? So that's that wood wide web. That's that communication back and forth. Y'all have seen, read the book, Finding the Mother Tree. It talks about how plants, like their kinfolk, right? Like they can somehow they can sense their kinfolk and make sure that they allocate resources to their kinfolk so their particular genetic signature continues on. That's just what survival is. It's really fascinating stuff, and it's underground, so there's so much that's mysterious about it because we don't see it. But they do experiments. They can prove a lot of this. So I wanted to show you this example of a seedling that has been inoculated with a mycorrhizal fungus versus one that has not. So when we think about that mycorrhizal relationship, it's a network of mycelia that's just extending the reach of the roots underground, right? So have you ever wondered how plants that grow on a dune in sand, how do they survive, right? Because it's like a sieve. Water goes through there. There's no nutrients, right? It is lean as lean can get in terms of soil quality. And it's because they have a mycorrhizal association. That mycorrhizal net can extend feet, like dozens of feet out into other areas and bring nutrients, to that plant. So that helps them thrive. It's just, it kind of solves some mysteries in a way. How are their dune grasses? Where are they getting their nutrients from? Well, they're getting it from, a fungal relationship that might be a 50-foot in diameter network underground that, is part of someone's yard that has more organic material in it, and they're just allocating it where it's needed. They can sense things. Let's see. Yep. So the fungus feeds on carbohydrates produced by the plant's photosynthesis. So that's the exchange. So they're getting the carbs, the sugars from it, and then in exchange they're bringing more water and nutrients to the tree. So about 90%, it's estimated, you'll find this number fluctuates, but about 90% of plants have to have this relationship, otherwise they will languish. When they do reforestation, they tend to inoculate tree seedlings with a mycorrhizal fungus just so they have a leg up. And if you can understand why looking at these pictures, right? If you had that network of support around you, you have a greater chance of surviving and thriving versus not having that network. So really important relationship. I'm only going to dive into this a little bit, but there's different types. If this fascinates you and you're like, man, I want to know more. There's different types of mycorrhizae. There's ecto and endo mycorrhizal structures. So it's all about how does it go into the root cells, or does it just stay on the outside of the root cells? Most of the mushrooms that we see are ectomycorrhizal forms. You tend to see them with conifers and hardwoods. These are the mushrooms, the basidiomycotas, the ascomycotas. Endomycorrhizal, so they typically don't produce mushrooms. It's very common out there, and we won't see the evidence of it all the time because they don't produce structures that come to the surface and reproductive structures that come to the surface. It's all just kind of done in the soil right there, so we'll never really see that. And they tend to be these more primitive fungi. That's just another little diagram showing it, going into the root cells versus just kind of working around the root cells. So the benefits, and I'm just reinforcing it really, is the increased nutrient uptake. One mushroom can connect many acres of forest in a continuous network of cells. Especially saplings and trees under stress. Like they can help each other make it through whatever is going on, whether it be like a drought season or something like that. Even fire, like recovering from low intensity fires can help them recover from that. We talked about the stress. Disease tolerance, that's another thing. We mentioned that fungus produce penicillins and medicines that help us. They attack bacteria. So that association can also help the trees or other hardwoods or whatever ward off these disease attacks. And it has to do, I explained it a little bit right here, with a physical barrier on the fungus, from the fungus on the mantle of the roots. So the roots are being protected underground. So that image is kind of showing you what's happening is that little, yes, sir.
Is the size of a mushroom above ground at all indicative of its spread underground?
Not necessarily the size of the individual mushroom, but how many you see. So you may see like dozens of them all popping up at once, and that you can almost it's like connect the dots. You can almost see what the spread of that mycelium is underground. All right, so now let's just jump into the mushrooms. I'm going to just show you some photos of mushrooms that grow around here that I've seen here. I am in no way a mushroom expert. It is a complex topic that even mycologists have to take time to understand. Mushroom ID is incredibly challenging. There are lookalikes that can only be separated out looking at microscopic characteristics. So I can't, it's irresponsible to walk out and look at something and go, oh, that white mushroom, yep, that's edible. That's this button mushroom. Don't do that. Don't rely on apps either. Apps are a tool, but they're not the end of it. They're not going to give you the conclusion you're looking for. Many of the characteristics that you need to thoroughly identify a mushroom take time, and it's things that the app can't see. You take a picture of a red-capped white-stalked mushroom and it'll say, oh, it's, genus species. And I'm like, well, how do you know that? Because there's 25 red-capped white stem mushrooms in this particular genus. How does it know to separate them out? So you can't go by that. You can use it as a tool. Maybe it says, oh, this is a russula. So you'll go to that chapter in the ID book and let me start with russula. Let me eliminate all these other possibilities. Let me focus in on that and see if I can identify it.
Have you ever gone out and gone foraging and eaten what you found?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how did you know that it was?
I have studied. I took a class in college and it piqued my interest, and I have stayed on top of educating myself. I've taken classes elsewhere with folks that are more experienced than I am. So I've learned from them. And it's my own research too. And I know enough to know I don't know enough. I do not get cocky with my IDs whatsoever. In fact, I am more on the cautious side. When I do walk and talks here for mushrooms, we're not eating mushrooms, we're not foraging, we're just doing an ecological walk. So we see what's out there and what its role is. That's not a realm I want to go into. And I'll tell you, it's not because I don't know what I see, it's because I don't know how you're going to react to them. So you can't, the one thing with mushrooms, the general statement, you can make no general statements about mushrooms. So even tried and true edible mushrooms, folks can have reactions to them and unforeseen reactions. Like I've been eating, there's a great example, a gentleman that I took some classes from, chicken of the woods, if you're familiar with that. We'll see a picture of it, but it's a common wild mushroom, looks like nothing else. You can't mistake it for anything. Ate it for years. And then he said one time, for whatever reason, he had a terrible reaction to it. A lot of stomach upset. So, you can make no generalities. And I'm not saying that to put the fear into you. I'm just saying you always have to be cautious. You can't jump to conclusions.
So the better way to go about it, if you wanted to harvest these, would be to inoculate it yourself so that you know what you're doing.
Yep, you can definitely do that. That is the safer route. One of the wild cards with foraged mushrooms is not knowing what the land had been used for prior to those mushrooms growing on there, right? So it is possible that the gentleman I'm talking about was in a field where they used to dump some kind of waste or heavy metals or something, who knows? Because we'll get into it, but mushrooms can, they have the ability to micro-remediate soil, so they can take contaminants out of the soil and metabolize them into non-harmful components. They do. They can uptake heavy metals, absolutely. And they'll clean the soil, but now the lead is concentrated in the mushroom. Yeah. So, you just don't know. But if you're doing cultivated mushrooms, you have a lot of control over what they're growing in, how they're growing, what they're exposed to. It's not foolproof, but it's more conclusive of what might happen. Yeah, so is that, I kind of went off on a tangent there. Was that all clear with what I was going on? Was it making sense? Sometimes I trail off. So what I want to talk about with these mushrooms are just the common species that you're going to find. And my goal with that is not that you're going to be able to say, oh, that's Amanita cochrae, that's this, that's that, to do genus and species. I just want you to start to see common traits of certain genus, of a certain genus. Like it might just become more familiar to you. Like, I see these 4 characteristics, and that's pretty, those are significant enough to make me think this might be this species. And it's just more for your enjoyment to, if you want to explore this a little bit more, it's a step in that direction that you have more of a knowledge base to build off of. One of the most common, so I'm starting with, I'm starting with mycorrhizal mushrooms. So these are the mushrooms that you're going to see that tell you there's a mycorrhizal relationship going on underground. So we're going to start with those guys first. We're going to go through a bunch of amanitas. Some folks say amanita, doesn't matter. So amanitas. Amanitas have some stable characteristics, I'll say, like you can pretty much count on them being key identifiers in the field. One is the fact that they have some kind of swollen base. If you look at that mushroom that's turned upside down, it has a swollen base. Sometimes it's just swollen, sometimes it's that sac like we saw in the other one, but there's something going on with the base that it is a significant characteristic. They have gills, and they usually have a skirt. It's called an annulus that you see around the stipe, and you can really see it on that one that's laying down. So that little skirt, those, and also too, if you look at the cap, do you see those kind of like flakes on there? I kind of call them oatmeal flakes. Those four characteristics will usually make me think, hey, that might be some type of amanita. Let me go through the identification process a little bit more. Let me take the next steps in figuring out what I'm looking at. And a lot of these love hardwoods and pines, you know, paying attention to where it's growing, what it's growing under or near can help you distinguish between two similar looking mushrooms. Like, oh, this one's definitely in a pine forest versus this guy over here is obviously associated with this oak tree that's over there because he's right up against the roots there. More amanitas to look at. This is Amanita rubescens. Uber common in the fall. You're going to trip over these. I see them so much in the forest. Again, if you look at the cap, you can see it has a little oatmeal flakes on it, right? It has the little ring. You can see the annulus on the stalk. The lower right picture has that ring. Don't have a great picture of you can kind of see a swollen base on that top picture there. And again, you know, we're looking at, and when I say gills, it's gills versus pores or tubes, like, so it's very distinguishable. We'll see pictures of both kinds. This one is interesting. When you cut it, it will turn red. You can see the stalk has turned red. So that will be, like if you're following the keys, the identification keys, these are characteristics you're going to start checking off. Oh. Amanita citrina, very common. These all are in the fall. Most of these you're going to see. There's only one mushroom that is exclusive to the springtime. Most of these you're going to see like starting, you may see them in July, but most of them, their peak season is September, October timeframe. So Amanita citrina. This one again, oatmeal flakes, that swollen base, that actually is a sac that it's sitting in, and then you see the ring around its the stipe there. There's other details that you'll start to pay attention to is how the gills attach to the stipe. Do they touch it directly? Is there a gap? Like, you know, there's a clear space, which means they're free. They're not attached to the stipe at all. Do they run down the stipes? Like, you know, that's a next layer of detail to start looking at. Oh, yes. Yep, exactly. It is named for the color. It's a very, very pale yellow. Very, very pale. And when you look at color of mushrooms, you need to just bear in mind what kind of weather we've had, right? Has it rained and kind of washed out the color of those mushrooms? So you would just bear that in mind, like, oh, it might have been brighter in color, but it's maybe an older specimen, or we just had, you know, rain overnight that could have kind of washed the color out a little bit. So this is Amanita caesarea group. One important thing to mention is early on, all of our identification books were based on European specimens because they were just advanced mushrooms and foraging mushrooms. Mushrooms were part of their culture, of European culture, for a long, long time. So they've grown up with it. It's passed down. It's something that is like a part of their daily life. That really we don't have that. You know, we're getting there, right? So there's this long history of knowledge. So that's what we were, the books were able to use the identified specimens based on what was in Europe. So the more we have advances with DNA, they start digging deep. Everything starts changing once you start looking at DNA, right? That's these taxonomists, they change it up all the time. So now we're starting to see the change where it'll say in Europe, it's known as Amanita caesarea. In North America, it's known as Amanita jacksonii. They're similar enough, but different enough. They're almost like identical cousins, right? They look almost exactly alike, but their DNA is different. But you only know that under those kinds of conditions. We couldn't tell that in the field. I learned it as Amanita caesarea, and as I've just tried to stay up to date on stuff, I have now learned that they have Amanita jacksonii or this other Amanita bangingiana, whatever. But for safety's sake, I say the Amanita caesarea group because it's still this evolving science. And you can see, look at that sac. That's super significant looking. They grow in Enchanted Forest, Mirror Lake. Gosh, you name it. Anywhere there's a forested system where lots of leaf litter, these guys are going to show themselves. And they're beautiful. They're like it's like a tequila sunrise drink in a mushroom.
Is that the vulva we're seeing?
Yep, that's the vulva. Yep, that sac. Yep. We do have deadly toxic mushrooms, deadly poisonous mushrooms that grow here. There's not many across the board, so there's only a few you really got to learn and be aware of. And then that helps if you know which ones to absolutely 100% avoid, helps you make decisions on what are you looking at. So Amanita virosis, how I learned it, that's the European name. Amanita bisporygia is the North American, and it's Eastern North America that you'll find this guy. So it's an Amanita that is stark. It looks like styrofoam. It is so pure white. It looks fake. It looks like you carved it and just put it in the ground. It's so white, so styrofoam-like. But this Amanita poisoning is one of the worst types of mushroom poisonings there are because there is no antidote, there's no cure. It's 72 hours is about all you got, and that's it. When you watch movies and they're like, oh, they put this mushroom in the soup and the person heals over 5 minutes later. That's not how it works. Amanita poisoning, it takes time. You have within 24 hours of eating an Amanita that's poisonous, you have symptoms that are consistent with food poisoning, right? You have the upset stomach, diarrhea, throwing up, those kinds of symptoms. And then you start to feel better. And you're like, oh, it's just something I ate, and which it is. Then in this time frame where you're starting to feel better, your organs are trying to process the toxins, right? Your liver and your kidneys are working overtime trying to process these toxins out of your system, but it's damaging them at the same time. So then within 48 hours, you start to have a downward spiral. And that's because your organs are starting to fail. And unless you can get an organ transplant, I'm not exaggerating. I really am not. I mean, you can look any of this up. This is pretty much the standard way it proceeds if there's an Amanita poisoning. Yes.
I felt like people know it's now.
In some cases, it's a quarter of a teaspoon.
Oh.
Yeah. And also certain species. I can't.
Where did this stuff grows?
All around.
Me and my dogs avoid it.
I've only seen this here once, we keyed it out in the field. I'm pretty certain that's what it was. I've seen it, the first time I ever saw the poisonous Amanitas, we were out at the Dismal Swamp in the class I took in college. And the teacher, we were going through the key to identify it. It was a different Amanita, I think one that's coming up. This one, we saw this one. Say again? I'm glad you brought that up. You can touch any mushroom. You can breathe the spores in. You can break it apart. It's not going to transfer through your skin. It's ingestion, so just don't eat it. Sometimes keys will say nibble a bit to see, not this mushroom, not this mushroom. Sometimes the bitterness of it, this acrid taste, is a key identifier. But that's not, again, what did I say? You can't make any generalities with mushrooms. You don't do that for every mushroom. Just follow what the key says. Don't, take it to heart like, oh, I can do that with any mushroom. No, don't do that. So just, it's all about ingestion is where the poisoning happens, right? So just don't eat it. Most of the poisonings that happen, European folks relocating, seeing a mushroom in our forests that look very similar to what they grew up harvesting, not realizing we have other species, a whole nother set of species that they're not familiar with. You just can't tell them apart, so look it up. There's stories galore of that happening, of foraging. Yes, ma'am.
It's like, I it's like there's lots of, or to find out about. So is there any like correlation with the very resistant ones on maybe what they grow on? Like why they're so poisonous because they break down a certain type of.
It's possible, like why would it be? If you think about why a fruit would taste bad, it's so that the animals don't eat it and the seeds are preserved and they continue its next generation. That's the guess, is somehow it's a deterrent for eating it or destroying it. Honestly, I don't know, like you alluded to, there's a lot of mysteries that are still to be solved. So, there's only a few that I do want to reassure you guys that the poisonous ones, it's a handful of them that you just need to know and know well. And you'll be fine. So if you're worried, you pick something up and you're like, oh God, it's all white. What do I have in my hand? There's 4 other mushrooms that are edible that are fine, but again, you're not going to transfer anything in your hands. It's all about what you eat. Of course, wash your hands if you feel nervous. It's okay. Your skin's a good barrier and that stuff's not going to come across your skin. Yes.
Like growing in the ground and you need to treat it with the fungicide, like in order to like.
Doesn't really work. Not the same application, unfortunately. This may fruit once every 5 years. Who knows? There's an unpredictability to it that you just can't assign any consistency to at all. And you may have come across it and not realize it. Everyone has survived because it's, nobody ate it. It was fine. And all the cultivated mushrooms, those are tried and true. Those no lookalikes, the cultivated ones that you buy the grow bags for and stuff. Nah, those have been vetted a million billion times. There's nothing else that looks like them. Okay. I didn't mean to freak y'all out with that. I do want you to know about it because you can't be cavalier about it at all. We had a gentleman come and do a foraging class here, mushroom expert from Asheville, and he was talking about a honey mushroom and that it's edible. And sure enough, someone in the crowd picked up a little piece and started nibbling on it. And he's like, when it's cooked, you gotta wait for the full story here, so he like freaked out and she was like, ah. So yeah, but it's just, you just need the awareness and just not be cavalier about it. And again, it's a small handful. So I don't want that to be your takeaway is like, they're all gonna kill me. What's your question?
It's kind of interesting. I was looking this up while you were talking. It says some authorities strongly advise against putting these fungi even in the same basket with those collected for the table and avoid touching them at all costs.
There you go. The way I learned is that you can touch them, you just can't eat them. But everyone be safe to your degree of comfort, right? Okay, now that we saw the scariest mushrooms possible, we'll forget that this is deadly poisonous, but I want you to look. Do you see the consistency and characteristics of the fruiting body, right? You see the skirt, you see that vulva, the swollen base. This may or may not, sometimes the oatmeal flakes just kind of wear off, just, they get dry and they fall off. This particular one, you can kind of allude to it. It's not the flash that's reflecting off the mushroom cap. It's actually very viscid. It's tacky. So when you touch it, like your skin sticks to it a little bit. I have touched this mushroom, when we were in that class, we touched that thing. I don't know how many times, and we're passing it around. We're like, oh my God, look at it, and I had no reaction to it. No ill effects. More ammonitis. How about this guy? This is the iconic Alice in Wonderland hippie trippy mushroom, right? The fly agaric, the Amanita muscaria. This has a lot of interesting folklore to it. It's actually tied to the story of Santa and the reindeers and all of that. I'll let you look up that story, but it's very fascinating. It comes from a Nordic folklore around the Amanita muscaria mushroom. And you can see why Santa has red and white in his outfit reflects back to this mushroom. This mushroom has been talked about as having like some psychoactive properties. I'll tell you a story. In my mushroom class, we had a project where you had to do something with a mushroom. Either you grew it, you cooked it, you did some kind of project with it. My teacher flipped his lid when he found out one of the students ate a little bit of that mushroom and then wrote down his experience for 24 hours. He reamed this student from one end of the class to the other, classroom to the other, about how irresponsible it was of him to take his life into that type of, danger, right? Because you don't know how you're going to react. So he wrote, and he had a horrible experience. He had fevers, he had stomach cramps, he had diarrhea, he felt awful. So that was the lesson learned. We were all just like, oh my God, most of us are like, I made a mushroom dish. I grew it on agar, very innocuous little things. But yeah, that has always stayed with me, how irate my teacher was for that. Just flipped his lid. It was it's a dangerous thing to do, to again, be cavalier about it. To me, this is the iconic Amanita, where you got the oatmeal flakes, the skirt, the swollen base with the vulva there, just all comes together. All right, I'm just showing you more. The goal of this is just so you're getting an image in your head of like, yeah, I've heard of Amanita. I know what it can look like. There'll be some exceptions to it. It may not have the skirt or something, but it'll have all the other characteristics. And there's one more characteristic that ties it all together, and that's the spore print, and I'll get into that a little bit after a few slides here. Look at this mycorrhizal guy. What is that? That doesn't look like any kind of mushroom anybody has ever seen, right? It's sometimes called dead man's foot because it looks like the heel of a dead body sticking up out of the ground. This is one of the best mycorrhizal species out there. It's a generalist. It'll form a relationship with everybody. And a lot of times this is what's inoculated on trees when they're getting planted for reforestation projects. This is all over the place here. This is, it's Mirror Lake by pine. I always see them by pines. And they're the type of like puffball. Like when you touch it, all of it just puffs away in powder. We have chanterelles here. So for your gourmands in the audience, we have some chanterelles. They grow at the base of oak trees here. We've seen the yellow ones. We've seen these itty bitty tiny little red ones over by Cobblestone Bridge. I mean, they're tiny, teeny tiny. One of the characteristics of them, it's a little hard to see, is they have decurrent gills. So they run from the edge of the cap all the way down to about the midway of the stipe. So it's very beautiful, very elegant. It's like an arching kind of characteristic. How about these little russellas? Have you guys seen these in the fall? They're all over the place. Let me show you. I'll go back. Have you seen this little guy? Everywhere here. So russellas it's a mixed bag of edibility. They're not going to kill you whatsoever, but it's a mixed bag. Some are just, they can cause some stomach irritation. They can taste like nothing. One of the very first mushroom walks I did here, I had a Russian gentleman in the class, and I said, oh, these are absolutely not edible. And he told me about the pickling process they do in Russia to extract some of the toxins, and then, which allows them to then be edible. And I was like, man, that's a lot of work. And then what does it taste like afterwards? Is it just like, a mushy vinegar blob? But it's just, again, it's a culture that has a long, long history with mushrooms. So what I want to point out with russellas, they have a very fat, stubby little stalk. It's like a big fat thumb as their stipe. And then their caps are usually like red. Let me go back. Sometimes they're white. But you see that stalk. They're just stalky little, fat stiped mushrooms there. This little guy. It looks like a piece of chalk to me. Like I always equate their stipe as like a big fat piece of chalk. So maybe that looks a little familiar to you guys. And here's someone coming up through through a crack in the asphalt and pushing some of the asphalt out of the way. Now, remember I said that their cell wall is made of chitin? That chitin is strong. And when the cells are expanding, it can burst through opportunities like that, you know, where there's a little crack in something. Okay. So how do we feel about Russell? I mean, it was a quick walkthrough of them, but hopefully you've seen that before. Interesting thing, if you go on a walk with me and we find Russell, is we're going to take them and crumble them up, throw them against the side of a tree because they break apart like feta cheese. You know, like when you crumble feta cheese, it's not a mushy mushroom. It's a very brittle and it breaks apart into chunks, and that's kind of fun to do, a little hands-on there. Okay, so we have some Cortinarius mushrooms. These are in the fall. They're these brown mushrooms. They have something called a cortina, which is that little webbing. That's kind of hard to see once they get mature. You have to look with a lens on the edge of the cap to see that. Look at this guy. Who loves morels here? Is anyone from morel country? Or okay, yes, great. So morels grow here. It wasn't really known until 2012 that we have 2 species that grow here on the East Coast. It was really thought of like mountains and further west, like a Midwest. You know, they have big morel festivals like Michigan and Wisconsin and stuff, Pennsylvania. So we have 2 species. We have Morchella virginiana and we have Morchella diminutiva. How to tell them apart, I have no idea, because one says, oh, like the head of it, you know, where the cap is, that brain-like structure is more egg-shaped, and the other one is more elliptical. I'm like, not elliptical, but like what did it say? Columnar-like, but still elliptical. And I'm like, what? It's confusing to me. I can't make heads or tails of that. I'm going to say this is Morchella virginiana because the guidebook, the information that I read says that it grows exclusively under tulip poplar trees. And it's this time of year that you would see those morels. And they're up now. I can't say that they're here. I haven't looked here, but somebody sent me a picture that they found them fruiting last week under a tulip poplar tree. So keep your eyes open. They're tiny. I mean, they're just like tiny, tiny. Okay, let's go into the parasitic mushrooms. These are the ones that could be causing problems for trees. So let's get an eyeball on those. This is chicken of the woods. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Are there any that kind of look like those that are not okay to eat?
That's a fabulous question. Yes. There's
I have like friends in Kansas, Missouri, and that's like the whole season for that.
Yes.
They'll go out and harvest them and like bring it back and put them.
So of course there's a false morel, you know, that you can come across. The difference is, I believe true morels are hollow when you cut them open, and false morels are they're thick. They have material and like a thick, solid stipe. Like these are hollow, absolutely, when you cut them open. That's one way to tell them apart. That's a good question. There's always going to be a lookalike. That's how mushrooms are. They're like, I'm going to make it real complicated. Okay, so this is chicken of the woods. How are we doing on time? I'm going to do a time check. Okay. So this can grow on live and dead trees. So it can break down dead, like a stump, or if you see it on a live tree, there's a problem. There's something going on in the hardwood there, the heartwood of that tree. This is a shelf mushroom. So it doesn't have your classic cap and stalk. It has these little like shelf structures that come out. It's called a polypore because it has pores, tiny little pores, as opposed to gills. So the picture on the left, I took here, and that's my phone case for reference, out in shady woods. So I don't know what was going on with this. It was growing really weird. I've just never seen that shape before. Now, there are mushrooms that parasitize, or fungus that parasitizes the mushroom, like the fruiting body. So it's possible there was some environmental condition that made it grow like that, or it had become infected with a parasitic fungus on the actual fruiting body. So I'm not really sure. I never saw it come to full fruit. It just kind of hung out like that for a while. Mushrooms are like us in that they take in oxygen and they release carbon dioxide. So if you grow mushrooms, you can't put them in a jar and seal it off and expect them to grow. You'll see they'll grow really weird when they're deprived of oxygen. Like they'll have a funky shape or they'll be deformed or something's up with them. So they need oxygen. And that's an edible one. It's called chicken of the woods because it has a texture. When you cook it, it's like chicken meat. You know, it gets very firm. It's not mushy. Looks like nothing else. Some people say it tastes like chicken, but I think it's really about the meat texture. It's just like cooked chicken meat. So these are honey mushrooms. We have two species here. We have Armillaria tubensis and Armillaria mellia. The difference between the two, they look identical. If you saw two clumps of these and you look down on them, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You just got to look, does one have a ring on the stalk or doesn't it? So if it has the ring, it's mellia. If it doesn't, it's tubensis. And I've seen tubensis here more than I've seen the mellia one. And this is what it looks like up against the tree. So if that's a live tree, you're like, yep, that's a problem. We're going to keep an eye on that. It is edible. This is the one that's edible only when cooked. Can't eat it raw. This was that lesson learner for that gal. Has anyone seen these? Sometimes they're at trees. Sometimes you see them in the middle of the lawn. And it's just like, it could be breaking down old root, runs, old roots that are in the ground. So it won't necessarily be at the base of a tree. It could just be a clump. And then a foot later is a clump. And then maybe 2 feet later is a clump, so you'll see, you can kind of imagine underground, there must have been a big root that it's chasing out. Ionatus driatus. This is one that grows around here too. Look at the droplets on there. This is kind of just this weird blob mushroom, but I see it. There's a big one in my neighborhood on a big oak tree that I keep watching it grow bigger and bigger. And I'm like, that's right along the road. I wonder what that's going to mean in time. But very interesting. That's just water droplets. They do, it's water. It's hydrophilic pressure, which is just water expansion, or, when those cells expand, it's due to water pressure. So it's just exuding some of the extra liquid out with that. So again, see that on the live tree, bad news. Look at this weird one, Phallus schwannitzii. We have one that reliably comes up in the picnic area on a pine tree out there in the little, that little circle area in the picnic parking lot. Very beautiful mushroom. They use it to dye natural fibers. It has a real pretty, like orangey color, kind of a browny color. Depending on which mordant you use, you can get different colors out of it. But again, this is kind of like a shelf mushroom. It's a polypore, not a cap and stalk mushroom. So it just creates layers, and it's somewhat perennial. Like I can go out there and probably find it now. It may not be actively growing, but I can see the old growth, the remnants of it. Oh, was this a mushroom? Y'all seen this before?
Yeah.
This is a trick question. We have a microphile in the front, so you can't answer. So no, it's not. Although it has no chlorophyll, right? So you'd be like, hey, you said mushrooms don't have chlorophyll, and this is a weird looking plant. This is ghost plant. It has no chlorophyll, but here's the rub with it. It's parasitic on a mushroom that's mycorrhizal with a tree. Mind-blowing kind of stuff in my mind, right? How in the world would they know this? How did scientists figure this out? Here's the quick, I don't think I have I don't have it there. So basically what's happening is there's typically a Russula species that is mycorrhizal with a tree, and then the plant is stealing that carbohydrate. Remember we talked about the tree photosynthesizes and gives carbohydrates to the fungus underground. So those roots are intercepting that transfer of nutrients and taking the carbohydrates for itself. So that's how it's parasitizing the mushroom. And how is this known? So they did some carbon tracing where, they had radioactive carbon that they, sealed off a branch, would put this radioactive carbon in there. The tree used that carbon to photosynthesize, so it's traceable in the tree. The tree converts that into a certain type of sugar. When the mushroom gets it, the mushroom converts it into a different type of sugar. So then when they looked at that sugar in the ghost plant, it was the mushroom sugar that they found in that plant. So that's how they traced the whole thing. You can read about it. It's just wild stuff, right? Who knew nature is that complicated underground? So this is actually a flowering plant. Have y'all, folks have seen this before out and about? Oh, it's much like the mushroom, itself. If the conditions aren't right, if the mushroom doesn't have enough like energy reserves, or it may not bloom itself. So you can't always guarantee you're going to see it, but you can see it at the base of. If you're going to look for it around pine trees. Last year we discovered a huge patch of it over here by the camellia garden. Huge. Like the more pine straw we moved, the more we saw. We're like, wow, this is super cool. So it was a good, easy one to bring folks to because it was kind of close to the visitor center. We could take a lot of tours out there. So just really cool. It's like I said, flowering plant. The flower just, when it matures, it actually straightens up and it just ejects the seeds out into the wild. I don't know how germination happens. That's something we're trying to try ourselves. So that'll be interesting. How about this? Is this a mushroom? Y'all ever seen this on mulch? This is called dog vomit. It's bright yellow, right? So it makes you think, yeah, kind of looks as described. But it's actually a type of slime mold as opposed to a fungus, a mushroom. So slime molds have a cellulose-based cell wall and a fungus has a chitinous-based cell wall. So that's one way to tell the difference. How they digest these compounds that they're breaking down is another way to tell a difference. I used to think this was like, oh gosh, this is some kind of disease near my trees. Like what's going on? This looks scary. And then I learned it's just another form of nature breaking down organic matter. So it's not a disease. It's not impacting the health of any living thing around it. It's just breaking down mulch, breaking down that lignin, that's in there. So, and this turns color over time. So when you see a fresh one, it is bright, bright yellow, like sulfur yellow. And then as it ages, it becomes more of an orange color to then it finally becomes like a brown color. And that's the spores maturing and, turning into powder. Our old parking lot medians used to get this all the time on the mulch there, and folks would call attention to it. I'm like, oh, it's so cool. All right, I'm gonna give you some fun facts. So that mycelium we talked about, that what's growing underground, certain species of mushrooms, it can be used to grow them in certain forms, right? So they look kind, like when you get a TV, in the cardboard box, you have the styrofoam protectants on the corner of the TV where they can actually grow mycelium to look like that form to protect the edge of the TVs. And it has other applications like that, right? So that's a great substitute, more environmentally friendly product than styrofoam for that. Plus it's stronger, mold resistant, fire resistant. I mean, it's a laundry list of benefits that you get from that. Plus it's a renewable resource, right? You don't have, it breaks down. You just throw it out in the woods and it'll just break down over time. Eco-packing Eco-Cradle was one company. I think there's a bunch of other ones now. It's really starting to catch on. They do it, it has a lot of applications now, and it's becoming, I think once they figure out the production of it to, get it on a fast track kind of thing, you'll start seeing it. I want to say that IKEA in Europe is using a lot of mycelium-based products for their shipping, for their like their furniture when they ship it and stuff. So we talked about mycoremediation. I talked about that just a wee bit, right? So there is a study where oyster mushrooms, which you can find in the store, which you can grow cultivated, you can get the bags and grow them, but they're a wild mushroom here. So oyster mushrooms can break down heavy metals, like 95% of those toxins are destroyed, and the mushrooms are free of the petroleum product, right? So it actually can metabolize those hydrocarbons into non-toxic components, which is really interesting and a very safer, cleaner way to, remediate these issues, when you have like oil spills or contaminated soil. So there's a study you can find, that explains how all of this, how they discovered all of this. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. 3 piles of soil, one's a control. all inoculated with hydrocarbons like an oil spill. One is a control, meaning nothing is done to it. One is inoculated with a bacteria, which when this experiment was done was the go-to method for cleaning up an oil spill. And then the last one had oyster mushrooms, mycelium inoculation on it, right? So all that mycelium was kind of placed in there. So the control, nothing's happening to it. There's no life on it. The bacteria, it's doing some stuff, but not much. At the end of the experiment, the one that had the oyster mushrooms was teeming with life. So the mycelium was breaking down the hydrocarbons in the soil. It produced the mushroom. The mushroom is a house, it's like a nursery sometimes for a ton of different types of insects. They'll lay their eggs in there, like gnats and beetles and all sorts of squigglies and wigglies live in there. So those squigglies and wigglies bring in birds, right? Because they want to eat what's going on in there. And the birds poop the seeds, the soil's now clean, and now you have, a whole new green layer of life there, and the other two piles have nothing. So you can look at that, you can look it up, that's the Cliff Notes version that I'm giving to you, but then there's nothing to clean up. There's no like drums of contaminated soil that's put somewhere forever and ever, just trying to figure out what to do with it, right? So it's a very, very encouraging application. Go to Pennsylvania. It's the mushroom capital of the world. They have a festival in September. And the reason why was, so Pennsylvania was like the hub for train transportation. So that's how a lot of food back in the day moved across country. So they were a good central point for getting food out before it spoiled and all. They produce somewhere around, this is just Pennsylvania, 853 million pounds of mushrooms a year, which equates to something like 863 million. Globally, it's a $50.3 billion industry. There's some money to be made. And mushrooms are fair. I mean, the ones the cultivated ones you think of, the button mushrooms, shiitakes, that magic's figured out. They know how to grow some stuff. So the most expensive truffle in the world sold in 2009, a 3-pound truffle, 3 pounds, $330,000. And it was sold to a casino owner in Macau named Stanley Ho. He bought it twice. One year it was 330. The next year it was another one, it was a little bit of a smaller mushroom, but it was a more desired species or something, $300,000. So, and these are still the leading numbers. Like I looked that up just to make sure these numbers were still accurate. So just saying. Mushrooms are very nutritious for us. They have sources of potassium, selenium, copper, B complex vitamins, what are the, I'm going to mess it up, phytoglucans or something. Super nutritious for us, but you just got to cook them. That's the main thing. It's not bad to eat them raw. It's just, remember we talked about that chitin-based cell wall. Chitin is something we can't digest. Folks can also be sensitive to chitin. So if you've ever had raw mushrooms, you're like, mushrooms aren't for me. They don't like me. It's just, they don't like that chitin. So if you cook it, you break down the chitin and you make everything digestible and available. So just make sure you cook them. And the largest creature on earth is a single honey mushroom fungus in Oregon. It's 3.5 miles across and 8,000 years old. That's not the mushroom, that's the fungus underground, right? So that's how big this one mycelium run is, right? And so it's parasitic. That's we talked about honey mushrooms, you saw that. So that can be bad news. All right, so one of the things that is helpful, I'm wrapping up here. So one of the things that's helpful in mushroom ID is you have to know what color the spore print is. You will get nowhere on a guide if you don't know what color that spore print is. That's usually the first question they'll ask you. Is it tan? Is it white? Is it purple? Is it green? Is it cinnamon brown? Is it cigar brown? Is it dark brown? All these, you had no idea how many levels of brown there are out there. But so the gills, and you can do this with mushrooms that have pores too. I'm just using gilled mushrooms as an example. All mushrooms can produce a spore print. Some are easier than others to get. Pop the cap off, put it on white paper. You can put it on glass if you want. Some folks like to do glass, but You always want to use white paper because white paper will give you the true color. If you use colored paper, it can throw off what you're looking at, right? Some mushroom spore prints are such a pale color of yellow that it would look white on colored paper, but on white paper, you can detect that, that yellow hint on there. So you pop the cap off, set it on white paper, and just set it aside somewhere, you know, in a non-drafty area for an hour, see what you get, come back. Sometimes it takes a few hours for, depending on the age of the mushroom and the conditions it was in, might take a couple hours or so for the spore print to deposit. Now, you don't want to do this inside your house. You don't want to do it on your kitchen counter. Remember, we mentioned squiggles and wiggles that like to live in these mushrooms. So they'll be in your house and you don't want that. So like do it on your back step or like in your garage or something like that. And then when you remove the cap, you should have some kind of spore deposit there, and it's going to be colored. It can be white. You may have to take the paper and tilt it to see, like you can, you know, see that there's a white powder. The shine, the texture of the paper changes. You can see that there's a white deposit there. So that will help you, and that sometimes is the only characteristic that will separate out a lookalike mushroom. One will have a white spore print. So this is a real life thing. We have a white mushroom that has a green spore print. We have a white mushroom that has a brown spore print. We have a white mushroom that has kind of like a flesh colored pinky tan color. We have a mushroom that has more of just like a pink in general color. And they all look super similar, right? So, but if you laid them all out cap to cap on white paper, let them do their spore print, you'll see you have 5 distinct species right there. And a spore print's like a thumbprint. It doesn't change based on the individual mushroom. It's tied into what species it is. So every species of that mushroom, every Amanita muscaria is going to have this yellowy white spore print, or this, you know, Russula is going to have this color. So it's very important that you know what that spore print is. You can do spore print art, you know, it's powder. I mean, you're going to touch it and it's just like having, you know, powdered sugar sprinkled on something. If you touch it, you're going to smear it. And then there's fairy rings.
That's what I'm.
Ah, yes. So this is literally where the magic happens, right? You step in the middle of it and the fairies come out and you get transported to some magical place, who knows? I wanted to point out, so yeah, you can totally, 2 pictures, one's from, both from my neighborhood, walking around looking at stuff. You can see the circle there on that little median strip. And then why I wanted to show you the picture on the right is that's where a fairy ring was, right? You can see there's just a couple little white specks in there of some of those mushrooms disappearing. But hopefully you noticed that where that ring was, it's dark green. Now we talked about where the fungus is and how it's breaking down nutrients. That's where nutrients are like happening, right? That's where the nutrients are happening. That's where that breakdown's happening. It's where those nutrients are being released. So you can see it's darker green. It's just like you did a ring of fertilizer on the grass right there. So that's a great like visual of what's happening underground. And the reason they grow in circles is just nature grows in radial patterns. It's not, I grew up thinking it was because it was an old tree there and they're just following the tree out from, you know, the old stump. But it's just radial patterns in nature. That's just how things grow. Yeah.
Is that essentially similar to mushroom compost, or why mushroom compost is valuable?
Yeah, mushroom compost is, it's kind of similar for sure. The value of mushroom compost is that it has these trace ingredients at low levels, which is very friendly to nature. Like you're not dumping tons of phosphorus on there, which then leaches into it's more natural for sure. It's not more synthetic kind of stuff. Oh, you can buy mushroom compost in bags, buy the bulk load. Mushrooms are everywhere. You can even buy at the big box stores, fertilizer that I think it's Espoma is the brand, has fertilizers that have mycorrhizal mushroom additives in it so that you can kind of inoculate the soil in a way for that. And just because I think I drilled this in, you guys are probably very cautious. Just because you see somebody else eating it, it doesn't mean we can eat it, right? Box turtles love, these are bolete mushrooms, big fat, they're kind of like related to porcinis, but big fat mushrooms. They love these guys, right? So they're spreading the spores around, you know, as they move around. But don't take that as a sign that it's edible. All right, you're gonna walk away with this, right? We're having a shroom boom and never munch on a hunch. That's gonna be your takeaway messages today, right? So, yep. So you can be an old mushroom hunter, you can be a bold mushroom hunter, but you cannot be an old bold mushroom hunter. If you're interested in diving deeper into this and just learning a little bit more, Mushrooms Demystified by David Aurora is excellent. It's written with humor. Mycelium Running is by Paul Stamets, and he's a fascinating person to follow. He's got these TED Talks that will blow your mind about the medicinal qualities, like true therapeutic value these mushrooms can bring to our lives. He's got a personal story about his mom having stage 4 breast cancer and using it in conjunction with conventional therapy, and it cured her. Like it helped. I'm not saying that, you know, together those therapies help, not one over the other. Together they helped each other do that. And then get a good like picture book too. I like to look at pictures when I look at, you know, the writings, like when an expert is describing it, I'm like, well, I want to be able to look at what he's saying because I don't always know what that means. These are just a few suggestions. There's a billion books out there, and I collect them all because they all have something to them that the other didn't have. So it helps me paint the full picture with that. So, and that is it. Question?
Mushroom compost thing, if you're using mushroom compost, would you expect to also have mushrooms grow like in your garden?
Yeah, it's more about the substrate that they're grown in. You know, like in the houses, you know, the grow houses where they have these like big trays they grow in. So it's not necessarily, it'll have some spores in it probably, but that's not the intention of it at all.